Three German shepherds appeared at her door. What followed changed the town forever. It started on the coldest morning of spring. A faint scratching, a paw print by the steps, and a pair of eyes, golden, unreadable, watching through the fog. No one knew where the three German shepherds came from. They arrived silently, like smoke, and stayed near only one person, a girl named Sienna, who hadn't spoken aloud in months. They didn't growl, didn't beg, just stayed. And so did she. What followed was a ripple, a slow unraveling of fear, suspicion, and, ultimately, a kind of grace no one saw coming. You'll hear people say animals sense things we don't. But these dogs didn't just sense. They remembered. They forgave. And they waited. This is a story about second chances, about a town that feared what it didn't understand, and a girl who knew better, even without saying a word. Stay to the end. You'll understand why. The morning fog rolled over Silver Glen like a breath too heavy to exhale. It wasn't just mist. It was a presence, thick and woolen, settling into every groove of the valley, curling around the fence posts like fingers seeking warmth. Barns blurred into the whiteness. Power lines vanished mid-air, and the outline of the hills melted into the sky. It was the kind of fog that made folks squint, even when they were sure they knew where they were going. The kind that turned familiar roads into something half-forgotten. And lately, it always seemed to carry a scent-wet cedar, churned soil, and something else, something restless. Inside the general store, old Merle Latshaw muttered about his missing goats again. Third morning in a row, said they'd been driven through his lower gate, trampled his vegetable patch, and disappeared as if they'd followed a ghost. 2 stools over, Ellie Jameson sipped her coffee too fast and burned her tongue, not because she was in a hurry, but because she didn't want to answer the question hanging in the air. "Did you hear about the Crowley boy?" someone finally asked. No one responded. They didn't need to. Everyone had heard. He was 12, went out to check the chicken coop before school and came back dragging one leg, jeans shredded from thigh to ankle, said it was a dog, or 3. Nobody saw it happen, but the boy's silence, afterward tight-lipped, eyes darting, spoke louder than any retelling. Some said he tried to touch one. Others said the dogs had been playing until they weren't. The sheriff's office was flooded with calls, most of them panic, some of them threats. Sheriff Denton tried to calm folks down. He posted warning signs and sent 2 men from animal control to set traps by the southern ravine. They came back the next morning with nothing but torn gloves, chewed fence wire, and 1 man limping. By then, the whispers were louder than any siren. 3 German shepherds, wild, silent, dangerous, no tags, no owners, not strays, something different. No one in Silver Glen could agree on what they were, but they all agreed on this. The dogs didn't belong here. Out in the rolling pastures at the edge of town, near where the paved road turned to gravel, then to dirt, the fog gathered heavier than anywhere else. That's where Spring Hollow sat. Not much more than a sprawl of barnwood and rusted hinges, but it had a kind of dignity in its patched corners. A place where animals were brought in broken and left, if they were lucky, whole. The property belonged to Lucas Marin now, though the land itself had belonged to Grief long before that. Lucas stood on the porch that morning with a mug in one hand and the railing in the other, as if both were needed to steady him. The coffee had long gone lukewarm, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes, pale, gray like ash that refused to fade, stared into the white haze. It felt close enough to touch, close enough to take something if he wasn't careful. Behind him, the old screen door creaked like it always did, a ghostly breath of its own. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. Sienna was awake. She was always the first one up. The girl sat curled on the porch swing, wrapped in her mother's old denim jacket. The sleeves were too long, the hem frayed. Her auburn hair had come undone again, her braid trailing like loose thread. In her lap, a sketchbook rested, pages already covered in shadows and lines. She hadn't said a word in over a year, not since the accident, not since the sirens, the hospital, the white walls, and the long silence that followed. Her voice, once full of morning questions and bedtime curiosities, had gone out like a candle caught in a gust. Lucas glanced over at her now, watching the way her pencil moved slow, deliberate, Like each stroke was trying to find something lost. She was drawing again. She always did when the fog came in heavy like this. "Cold morning," he muttered, not expecting a reply. She didn't look up, just kept shading. He tried to smile, but his face didn't remember how. So he just sipped the coffee and stared out again. That's when he saw them. At first, they looked like part of the mist shadows given shape. 3 figures at the far end of the field, just beyond the broken fence line. They didn't move like deer or elk. They were low, alert, watching. His heart kicked against his ribs, not in fear, not yet, but in knowing. The largest was pitch black, regal in her stance, like a queen assessing a boarder. The second, reddish tan, paced just behind here ears high, tail stiff, movement coiled. The last was barely more than a blur, lean and gray, uncertain, lingering as if unsure whether he belonged. Lucas didn't breathe, didn't blink. He'd seen dogs in combat, seen them calm and killing. He knew power when he saw it, and control when it was one wrong breath from breaking. The dogs didn't advance, they just stood and watched. And in that moment, Lucas realized something strange. The black one, her eyes weren't scanning for prey. They were searching for something, as if she were waiting. He tightened his grip on the railing, unsure why his hands had begun to shake. Behind him, the porch swing creaked once. He turned, and for a second, everything inside him stopped. Sienna was no longer sitting there. The sketchbook still lay open, half a drawing of the same 3 dogs. But the girl was gone. They moved like smoke just out of reach, just beyond clear definition, haunting the wooded fringe where town met wild. In Silver Glen, they were no longer whispered about as dogs or even strays. The word most often used now, especially in the early mornings when coffee hadn't yet dulled the edge of fear, was presence. They weren't seen as animals anymore. They were something between memory and myth. It always started the same. Movement on the edge of vision, a soft growl carried too far on the wind, a sudden hush in the birdsong. Then came the prince pause, too large, too clean to be coyote, too deliberate to be lost. No pattern, no certainty, just signs and stories. 3 of them, always 3. The first was the largest, midnight black, with eyes like burnished coal. Her name, unknown to anyone but perhaps herself, would eventually become Naira. But for now, the townsfolk called her the Shadow. She carried herself with eerie stillness, moving not with the hunger of a predator, but the authority of a sentinel. Her head stayed low, her gaze direct. People said she watched fences the way a soldier watches borders, like she remembered what it meant to protect, but had long since lost what to protect for. Naira never barked, never chased. She just watched, and that, somehow, was worse. The second was fire and motions hoarder in height, thicker in build. His coat, a deep russet that looked almost aflame in the sunlight. Taro, though no one called him that yet, moved with the urgency of a nerve exposed. His legs twitched even at rest. His hackles rose at every new sound, every shadow that moved wrong. He was the one people feared, most not because he had done the worst, but because he might. Farmers spoke of the way he paced, back and forth like a fuse that never fully burned down. One rancher swore she saw him leap a 5-foot fence in one bound. Another said he snapped clean through a chicken coop latch with his teeth. His eyes, copper-toned and always wide, missed nothing. When he appeared on camera trap footage, he was always in motion circling, doubling back, nose to the ground, tail rigid. He wasn't a ghost. He was a warning. And then, there was the third. Sol. Smaller, thinner, the gray in his coat dulled by mud and time. His body was long, legs gangly, ears never quite upright. If the other 2 were Storm and Spark, Sol was mist-shifting, soft-footed, unsure. He lingered in the background of every sighting, the afterthought trailing behind. Sometimes, he looked like a pup. Other times, older than time. More than one person described him as the eyes you don't expect to meet. Because once you did, it was hard to forget them. Unlike Naira or Taro, Sol didn't stare down threats. He watched from a distance, behind rocks, through grass, from the tree line, nose barely visible, as if he were always deciding whether he belonged in this world or any world at all. The three of them had no origin, at least not one anyone could agree on. Some said they were dumped military dogs, abandoned after service. Others believed they'd escaped from a training compound across the state line. Rumors of underground breeding programs, of dogs too smart, too volatile to be kept. A few spoke lower still, with the weight of local superstition, about wolves that bred with war dogs, about spirits that took shape when left alone, too long in grief. But whatever they were not welcome. Not in the minds of ranchers counting their losses. Not in the nightmares of children who'd once played free near the woods. And certainly not in the twitching fingers of men with scoped rifles and little patience. And yet, despite the growing hysteria, the dogs remained untouched, unclaimed, untouchable. Even Sheriff Denton's best efforts had come to nothing. Trail cams only caught glimpses. Naira, standing statue still near the old cattle fence, eyes glowing back in infrared. Taro, mid-run, blur-legged and wild. Soul behind them both, head down, ears half back. One paw lifted mid-step like he was rethinking his existence. Animal control refused to try again after the second attempt. "They're not normal," one officer said, shaking as he handed over the chewed remains of a tranquilizer dart. "They don't react like dogs." No one disputed it. There was a particular field at the northern edge of town where fog collected low and thick. At dawn, you could sometimes spot three dark shapes there standing just beyond the fencing, never crossing, never close enough to shoot, never far enough to forget. They weren't stalking prey. They were patrolling. And that unsettled people more than if they'd attacked outright. In a town like Silver Glen, where everything had a place, the unknown wasn't just frightening, it was infuriating. What do you do with something you can't catch, can't name, can't punish? You start imagining worse. So they gave them names in private: the widow, the fire, the ghost. Talk circled tighter each day. Farmers began keeping floodlights on at night. Children weren't allowed to walk home alone from the school bus. Horses spooked more often. And the line between caution and paranoia blurred quickly. Still, the dogs never crossed into the heart of town. They kept to the edges close enough to see, too far to reach. Some nights, Lucas Marin thought he could hear them from his bedroom window, not barking, just moving. Grass bending, hooves thudding away. A silence disturbed in the way a pulse might quicken beneath the skin. He'd fought in places where landmines slept under dirt, where silence meant something was already watching. And this felt the same. He didn't tell Sienna. Not that she would have responded. She hadn't said a word in over a year. But she watched the same tree line every morning, same as the dogs did. And Lucas had the strange, aching suspicion that somehow they were watching each other. From opposite sides of a fence, no one could see. The house on the ridge wasn't much to look at. Its bones were older than Lucas Marin himself, and they creaked like they remembered better days. The porch sagged at one corner where the ground had slowly given way. Paint peeled like brittle skin along the railings, revealing layers of colors once chosen with care. But even so, in the morning fog, it looked like a sentinel, worn down, sure, but still standing. Lucas sat at the edge of the porch with a chipped enamel mug cradled in his hands. The coffee inside had cooled, but he drank it anyway, grimacing at the bitterness, not because of the taste, but because the heat was long gone and he hadn't noticed when it left. He rarely did anymore. The cold made his knees throb, especially on mornings like this. The kind of bone-deep ache that pulsed in time with his memories. Afghanistan hadn't left many souvenirs he wanted to keep. But the pain sharp on the left, grinding on the right, never forgot to come home. He shifted slightly, elbow against the post, his eyes scanning the tree line down in the lower pasture. Nothing moved. But that meant nothing. The fog played tricks, and lately, it played often. Behind him, the screen door creaked open soft, almost polite. Then came the quiet scuff of bare feet and the faint rustle of fabric. No words. There never were. Sienna moved like she was part of the morning. It's quiet, observant, unseen if she chose to be. She settled on the porch swing, knees tucked to her chest, one hand holding the edge of her mother's old denim jacket closed, the other balancing a worn sketchbook on her lap. Lucas didn't look at her right away. He'd learned not to. Attention could make her vanish. even if her body stayed. Some part of her always hovered just outside herself. The swing creaked once, then stilled. She began to draw. He could hear it, faint scratches of graphite on paper, the sound soft as breath. She always drew in the early hours, before the world fully woke. It was like she needed the hush to find her rhythm. Lucas took another sip of his bitter coffee and exhaled slow. His breath clouded in the cold, curling like smoke. He wanted to say something gentle, something useful. But words had stopped working a long time ago. Sienna hadn't spoken in over 14 months. Not since the crash that stole her mother. Not since the screaming, the rain, the fire truck that never came fast enough. And even though Lucas had raised men under gunfire and comforted the dying with his hands pressed against open wounds, nothing had prepared him for the silence of a child who had nothing left to say. She had been 8 when it happened. She was 9 now. But in the way she carried her quiet shoulders, tired eyes, that way she stared too long at nothing, she seemed older and younger all at once. Lucas had tried everything. Counselors, therapists, church. He even let that one woman from Boulder come with her singing bowls and crystals and awkward questions. Sienna hadn't blinked once, and so the world learned to live around her, quiet. Except Lucas never did. He watched her now, watched the way her braid hung lopsided and loose, the ends damp from the mist. She hadn't let him comb it in weeks, not since she started waking before him. Her pencil moved with purpose. She wasn't doodling. No childish sons with smiling faces, no houses with tilted roofs, just shadows, shapes, sometimes animals, sometimes eyes. But lately, the drawings had changed. Now they had teeth. He didn't tell her what he saw in them. The sharp lines, the tension, the way she captured motion without needing color. Some mornings, he found pages tucked under her pillow. 3 figures, always together. One black, standing tall. One reddish, bristled and angry. One gray, curled back like smoke. She had never seen the dogs. Not really. Not up close. Or at least, he didn't think so. But there was something in those sketches, something that felt truer than a photograph. Lucas cleared his throat. It came out rough. "You warm enough out here?" he asked. No answer. Just graphite on paper. That soft sound again. That stubborn rhythm. He didn't press. Didn't need to. This was their dance. Max barked once in the barn, then fell silent. Not an alert bark. Not quite. But not nothing either. Lucas glanced toward the pasture. The fog had thickened again, rising like breath from the earth. He stood, knees groaning, and stepped down from the porch. Gravel crunched beneath his boots as he moved toward the edge of the yard. The gate swayed slightly, its latch never quite holding right. Then he saw them. 3 shapes, motionless, just beyond the outer fence. His breath caught, not from fear, but something older, something heavier. The black one stood closest, not aggressive, just still, like she was weighing the land, measuring him. The red one paced 2 steps behind, restless, twitching, tail high. The gray one hung back, ears uncertain, one paw lifted mid-step. Lucas squinted. "They're real," he whispered. He turned to call back, only to find Sienna wasn't behind him. His stomach dropped. She was already past the porch swing, her sketchbook forgotten, her bare feet soundless on the dew-wet grass. She walked toward the field like someone stepping into a dream. Lucas froze, heart punching against his ribs. "Sienna," he started, but his voice was too small, too late. She walked like she knew the path, like she had walked it 100 times in her sleep. The fog parted slightly around her, brushing her shoulders, tangling in her hair. 20 yards. 15. The dogs hadn't moved. Lucas felt the old fear, risen out battlefield fear, but the fear of a man who has only one thing left in the world and might lose it to silence. The air pulsed. Sienna stopped, just shy of the fence line. The black one nearer lifted her head, and for a heartbeat, time held its breath. The morning light was soft, pale as milk, slipping in slivers through the dusty blinds of the old house on the ridge. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the cedar trees, whispering secrets only the lonely could hear. Inside, Lucas Marin sat hunched over a kitchen table marked with rings of time and spilled coffee. His hands, once steady in field hospitals far from home, now trembled slightly as he lifted the chipped mug to his lips. The taste was bitter, stale but familiar, like him. Across the room, Sienna sat with her legs tucked beneath her, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her frame still as a photograph. The only sound was the occasional scratch of pencil against paper. She hadn't spoken a word in 378 days. Lucas knew because he counted, like soldiers count casualties. No therapist had been able to break through. No relative, no soft voice, no song. After her mother Lucas's daughter died in the flood, Sienna's voice had simply vanished, swallowed by grief too heavy for a child to carry. But she drew, page after page. At first, it had been memories, her mother's hands, a favorite mug, a wind chime that used to hang outside their old home. Then the drawings changed. Now they were filled with dogs, 3 of them, over and over again. Lucas didn't understand at first. He thought maybe they were just inventions, a child's way of retreating into something safe. But the way she sketched them, each stroke was too deliberate, too accurate. The black one massive, regal, a gaze like coal under moonlight. The red one alien and angular, always mid-motion, caught in some invisible tension. And the gray one eyes wide, uncertain, as if searching for a path home. He stared now at the latest sketch as Sienna gently turned the page and began to shade the fur of the red one's flank. Her pencil moved in delicate curves, breathing life into the shape, as if she weren't just drawing but remembering. He cleared his throat. "Where'd you see them?" His voice, rough with rust, barely broke the stillness. She didn't look up. Didn't even blink. Just kept drawing. Lucas let out a slow breath and leaned back in the chair, its old joints creaking under his weight. He glanced out the window toward the tree line. That same mist hung there this morning, silver and thick like soup, curling through the pines and the skeletal remains of old fencing. That was where the rumors started, where the livestock had gone missing, and some kid came home with stitches down his arm and a story nobody believed. The townsfolk spoke of wild dogs, rabid and angry, of shadows with teeth. But here Sienna was, drawing them as if they were saints. It unsettled him, not just because of what it meant, but because he recognized something in the dog's eyes, something he hadn't seen in years. Pain, recognition, a kind of waiting. He pushed himself up from the table, joints protesting, and walked over to Sienna. She didn't flinch as he sat beside her. He never hovered, never pushed her to speak. That was rule number 1. Never rush a silent heart. She flipped back through earlier pages, letting him see them again. The black one, Nairahe remembered the name scribbled in shaky cursive beneath the first portrait. Then Taro, the red blur. And finally Soul, whose eyes always looked like they might break into tears if someone whispered the right word. Lucas ran a calloused finger along the edge of the paper. "You ever touch one?" he asked, softer now. She hesitated, then nodded. Barely. He felt something ripple across his spine, part chill, part memory. He had once trusted a dog more than any man in his unit. A shepherd named Rook, back in a place where IEDs hummed under the soil and nights smelled like copper and sweat. He'd watched Rook take a bullet meant for a medic. He remembered the weight of Rook's body in his arms, heavier than any loss he'd known until he got the call about his daughter. And now Sienna, this child made of silence and sketches, was drawing ghosts in the shape of dogs. Lucas didn't believe in angels, not anymore. But he was starting to believe in Sienna's eyes. He rose and gently tousled her hair. "You keep drawing," he murmured. "Just let me know if they get any closer." She didn't respond. But as he turned to leave the room, she paused, then flipped to a blank page and began to draw a house, not theirs, but another, smaller, falling apart at the edges, smoke curling from a chimney. And in front of it, the 3 dogs. Only this time, they weren't wild. They were waiting. Lucas stared at it later that night after Sienna had gone to sleep, her pencil still in hand, sketchbook pressed to her chest like a heartbeat. The picture stayed in his mind as the mist grew thicker outside, cloaking the ridge in a kind of breathless stillness. He didn't know what it meant yet, but something in his gutsome, ancient soldier's instinct told him these dogs weren't just wandering. They were returning. The clock in the hallway, ticked like a distant metronome, steady and indifferent. Moonlight slanted through the high window, cutting the dark into bars across the old hardwood floor. The house on the ridge slept, but not everyone inside did. Sienna lay still under her blanket, eyes open. Not afraid, just waiting. She didn't know for what, only that something had shifted, like a thread tugged loose in the fabric of her dreams, trailing her awake. Her fingers moved softly over the edges of the sketchbook beneath her pillow, habitual now. Even in sleep, she needed the comfort of graphite, of outlines and shadows she could control. The trees outside rustled, though there was no wind. A hush passed over the land, as if even the pines were holding their breath. Then came the bark, short, sharp, not frantic, but focused. Max. From his old post near the back porch, the shepherd mix rarely made a sound anymore. Once the alpha of the sanctuary, Max had aged into near silence. His eyes dimmed, but his instincts somehow sharper. When he barked, it meant something. Sienna sat up, clutching the sketchbook to her chest. Her bare feet met the cold wood floor like she'd done this before in some half-memory she didn't own. Lucas had left the back porch light on again, always too tired to remember. Through the hallway, a soft glow called her forward. The rest of the house remained steeped in stillness. She crept past the framed photos on the wall, her mother's face, smiling in faded summer light, frozen forever in time. Sienna didn't look. She couldn't. Not yet. As she opened the door to the back, the night air hit her in a cool hush. Max stood rigid, facing the tree line. His ears perked, but his body still, like a statue chiseled by tension. He didn't acknowledge her. Sienna followed his gaze. The woods beyond the ridge were soaked in mist, rolling low like breath on glass. Somewhere in that gray, just at the edge of light, something moved. She didn't flinch. She only gripped the notebook tighter and stepped forward. Max growled low. Warning but didn't stop her. At the edge of the yard, the air thickened. Sienna could hear her own breath, fragile and paper-thin, and then footsteps, heavy but soft, like something that should weigh more but didn't. Then came the eyes. First a pair, then another, and a third. 3 silhouettes emerged from the veil of fog, not charging but circling an orbit of instinct. Naira's eyes glinted like obsidian in the dark, calm, commanding. Taro paced to her left, muscles twitching like fire under skin. Saul hung back, hesitant, ears low but alert. They didn't growl, didn't lunge, just watched. Sienna felt the pulse in her ears, loud as thunder. And yet, her hand moved on its own, flipping open the sketchbook to a blank page. A pencil she didn't even remember picking it up waited between her fingers. She drew, kneeling right there in the dew-wet grass, not looking at the page, only at them. Lines formed. Smooth. Certain. Like she'd done it before 100 times. But this wasn't copying. It wasn't even memory. It was knowing. Max barked again, louder this time. But he didn't advance. Lucas's voice cut through the night like a rusty blade. Sienna. His steps thundered on the porch. He stopped dead when he saw her silhouette at the yard's edge, alone facing 3 massive dogs. "Get back here," he shouted, but his voice cracked midway. The dogs turned, not in fear, in understanding. Naira gave a soft, breathy chuff. Saul took a slow, backward step. Taro hesitated longest, eyes flicking between Sienna and Lucas. Then, one by one, they vanished into the mist, swallowed like shadows fleeing dawn. Sienna didn't move until they were gone. Then she stood, hugging the sketchbook to her chest like it held her ribs in place. Lucas reached her and dropped to one knee, breath ragged. "What were you thinking?" he rasped, gripping her shoulders. "Those are wild animals, Sienna. They could have—" She turned her face to him, the faintest lift at the corners of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Not yet. But her eyes, they glowed. Lucas froze. He hadn't seen that light in over a year. Not since before the funeral. Not since the last words she spoke. He looked down at the open page. 3 wolves know, dogs drawn with aching precision. The black one regal, the red one blazing, the gray one uncertain. He stared. They were real. he whispered. It wasn't a question. Sienna didn't nod, but she didn't need to. Inside the house, a wind moved through the hallways, unsettling nothing and everything at once. The fog came low that morning, not like a drifting mist, but like something deliberate thick, weighty, as if the sky itself had bent down to breathe over the land. Lucas Marin woke with a throb in his knee and the bitter taste of unfinished sleep clinging to the back of his throat. The house creaked as old wood met cold air, and the fire in the stove had long gone out. He reached for his coat, but paused when he realized something was wrong. Silence. No footsteps. No kettle on. No Sina. "God damn it!" he hissed under his breath, already limping to the door. Outside, the world was drowned in white. The hills, the trees, the crooked fence line all dissolved into that thick, spectral veil. Even Max, the old shepherd from the sanctuary, stood rigid near the porch, ears forward, body coiled tight like a wire. Then Lucas saw it. A small figure, barefoot, hair loose and haloed by the fog, was walking toward the far edge of the property. Sienna. He didn't stop to put on proper boots. The frozen ground bit through his soles, but pain had never slowed Lucas Marin when the stakes were flesh and blood. "Sienna!" he shouted, voice shredded by wind and fear. She didn't turn. She walked steady, like someone in a trance, straight toward the western ridge where the pines grew thinned. Just beyond that, the fence that marked the end of everything known. Lucas cursed again, forcing his body to move faster than it wanted. Each step sent a shock of pain through his joints, but he kept going. Somewhere behind him, Max Barkita, low, guttural sound, not of alarm but warning. And then Lucas saw them. 3 shapes, barely visible in the fog, standing just beyond the crooked wire fence. Nira, Taro, Sol. The nameless dogs. The ones the town whispered about in coffee shops and over fences. The ones that shouldn't have been there at all. Sienna stopped just a few feet from the boundary. The wind tugged at her dress. She didn't blink, didn't speak, just stood there facing the creatures that the others feared, but she had already seen again and again in the pages of her sketchbook. Naira stood tall, black as coal and twice as cold, her yellow eyes burning with something ancient. Her lips peeled back, silent but unmistakable. A growl that didn't need sound to be heard. Taro circled once, restless, the red in his coat gleaming faint even in the fog. He was always the first to strike, the one who didn't trust, his ears pinned low. But it was Sol who moved first, the gray one, hesitant, young, or maybe just gentler. He stepped toward the girl, head tilted, as if reading something beneath her silence. Lucas reached the clearing, just as the boy dog took that final step. He froze, heart stammering against cracked ribs. The fog curled around his legs like smoke. "Sienna," he said, softer now, as if even breath could shatter the moment. She turned her head slightly, enough to acknowledge him, but not enough to move away from the fence. Then something happened. Sol stopped, and Sienna smiled. Not wide, not exaggerated, just a gentle lifting of the lips. Barely there, but it was enough. It was the first time Lucas had seen that smile in over a year, since her mother's accident. Since the scream that never came out, Sol let out a sound of soft chuff, almost confused, and took one more step forward. Naira growled now, real and sharp. A warning. She didn't trust this. But Sienna, small and still in the fog, slowly lifted her hand, palm open, fingers steady. No fear. Sol's nose touched her fingertips like a ghost brushing memory. And for a moment, time folded inward. There was no war, no grave, no silence. Just a child and a dog who didn't know his name. Lucas didn't remember walking forward, only the sound of Max snarling low behind him. Not at Sienna, not at the dogs, but at the air itself, like something unseen hovered nearby. He stepped beside his granddaughter, gently reaching for her hand, but she didn't move. She was breathing slow, eyes fixed on Sol. And then she whispered. "Sol," she said. One word, her first word in over a year. Lucas dropped to one knee, overwhelmed, not by joy, not yet, but by a wave of something deeper, grief that had turned into hope without warning. "Sol," she repeated, a little stronger. The gray dog's ears twitched. He blinked slowly. Something softened in his body. Not submission, not even trust, just recognition. And Naira, though still tense, stepped back a pace. Taro snorted, agitated, but did not charge. The moment held, suspended in fog and memory. Then Sienna stepped back, her hand slipping gently from the dog's muzzle. "We'll come back," she whispered, not to Lucas, but to them, to all three. Lucas placed his hand on her shoulder. "Come on, kiddo, let's go home." She nodded, eyes still on the shapes behind the fence. And for the first time since her world fell apart, she followed the sound of someone's voice. In a town where the silence stretched longer than the shadows at dusk, Silver Glen didn't need much to stir. But what stirred it that Monday morning wasn't just gossip, it was something else. Something that threaded between fear and reverence. The kind of unease people didn't name out loud. It began at the diner. Rhonda, silver curls tight against her temple and a cigarette dangling dangerously close to her lipstick, slapped a grainy screenshot onto the counter beside the coffee pots. "Look at this," she muttered, voice low but urgent. The image was from the feed outside the old animal sanctuary, a clip pulled from security cam footage no one ever really checked. There, clear as daylight, stood the girl, Sienna Marin, in her pale flannel pajamas and bare feet, hair loose and wild like the fog around her, facing three dogs that no one in town could get close to without locking their car doors. Naira, Taro, and Saltho. Most folks didn't know their names. They were just them. The ghost dogs of the ridge. The girl had her hand out. Sol, the gray one, had stepped forward. And Sienna, she was smiling. By lunch, the footage was on every phone, from the barber shop to the church basement. Sheriff Danner had seen it 5 times by noon, sitting stiff behind his desk with a jaw clenched so hard you could hear the bones grind. He didn't like it. Didn't like what it meant. Dogs like those weren't meant to be tamed. Weren't meant to approach, and definitely not meant to lean in with ears soft and bodies low like they remembered something kind. "I want that girl kept indoors," he muttered, not even looking at the deputy. "And those animals, whatever they are, need to be put down before someone gets hurt." But not everyone saw danger in the footage. At the community center, Mrs. Calloway, who'd buried her son 2 years back and had never quite stopped shaking, watched the video in silence, tears gathering in her soft eyes. She smiled, she whispered. "God help me," she smiled. Sienna hadn't spoken a word since her mother's accident. Not one syllable. The town knew that silence, like it knew the mist off the hills. It had become part of the landscape. Her presence was quiet. Her footsteps barely heard. Her drawings, the only way she seemed to breathe. And now this. Lucas Marin sat on his porch, mug cooling in his hands, watching the town move like stirred ants. He could feel their eyes drifting toward his house, with something close to superstition. Not outright blame, but something hovering near it. Suspicion, maybe, or awe. He'd seen that look before. Overseas, right before a village turned on itself. He didn't know what scared him more, that Sienna had walked to those dogs alone, or that she hadn't seemed afraid. He replayed the clip again. Naira had growled a deep, low rumble like something old waking up but hadn't lunged. Taro had paced, tail rigid, eyes flicking between shadows. And Sol had stepped forward with something in his posture that didn't match the rest of him. It wasn't submission. It was recognition. Lucas rubbed his hand across the back of his neck. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe the girl just got lucky. Maybe it was nothing. But when he went to ask her about it, about that moment at the fence, Sienna only looked at him with those wide, still eyes. She hadn't picked up her pencil since. Just sat on the steps with her arms around Max, the old dog who'd been at the sanctuary since before the others came. That night, the fog rolled in heavier than usual, blanketed the road, softened the trees until they looked like ghosts. And still, the town buzzed with half-whispers. At the corner store, 2 teenagers passed around the clip on a cracked phone, laughing nervously, like they weren't sure whether to be impressed or creeped out. At the feed store, old Dan muttered something about curses and dogs that remember war. And on Facebook, the footage was already stitched with dramatic piano music and labeled "The Girl and the Wild Ones." No one remembered uploading it. But by morning, it had over 40,000 views. The town was no longer quiet. And Sienna, for the first time in a year, had become the center of something too big to undo. The fluorescent lights of the Silver Glen Town Hall buzzed faintly overhead, throwing a sterile glow across folding chairs and dust-rimmed floor tiles. Outside, the air still carried the last chill of dusk, but inside, heat simmered quiet at first, like an ember tucked beneath dry leaves. It started with murmurs, then boots scuffing linoleum, then the scrape of metal chairs being pulled closer, tighter. The old building hadn't been this full since the snowstorm of '98. Every face carried something different: wrinkle-set wariness, hardened worry, or barely concealed panic. Sheriff Ray Denman stood at the front, fingers clutched on the edge of the lectern like a man bracing for incoming fire. He was a broad-shouldered relic of old lawmen, the kind who spoke little and aged fast. He cleared his throat, but before he could speak, voices rose from the crowd like static breaking loose. "They're wild," someone barked from the left side. "Nearly took out my sheep last week." "You don't know that was them," replied another, but it didn't matter. The seed had been planted. A tall man in a denim jacket, face sun-dried and lined from years working fields, stood up abruptly. "What more proof do you need, Sheriff? We've all seen the footage. That little girl Marin's granddaughter standing out there with 3 strays that look like wolves more than dogs. You want to wait till someone gets bit?" Lucas Marin shifted uncomfortably near the back, Sienna by his side, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. She hadn't let it go all day. Even now, even under the flickering lights and the hum of angry voices, her grip on it was firm, not defensive, just attached. "Mr. Bramble," the sheriff started, attempting calm. "I understand your concern, but we don't act on fear alone." "Fear?" Bramble shouted. "That's not fear. That's sense. You seen what they did to Jenkins Gate? Tore straight through. If that girl hadn't been there—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the silence did. A ripple of agreement swept through the room. Arms crossed, heads nodded. That was when Lucas stood. Slowly, with effort, one hand pressed into his lower back like he was lifting a weight older than himself. His other hand reached gently toward Sienna, as if to borrow strength. "I'll speak," he said, voice low and gravel, worn. "If you'll let me." The crowd turned. A few recognized him. Many didn't. But all knew the name Lucas Marin. The man who'd gone to war, who'd buried his daughter, who now lived up on the ridge with the girl who never spoke. Sheriff Denman stepped aside, without a word. Lucas took the front slowly, the limp in his gait catching the corner of every watching eye. He looked at them for a long moment, then down at Sienna, then back again. "I ain't got answers," he said, voice quieter than expected, but steady. "I've seen war. I've seen animals that were trained to hurt, and I've seen ones that only wanted to survive. I won't stand here and tell you those dogs out there ain't dangerous. But I will tell you, something happened." He paused, as if waiting for permission to go on. "My granddaughter hasn't said a word since her mother passed. Not one, not even in her sleep. She draws. That's all she has. And lately, she's been drawing them." He gestured, nodding to the sketchbook. "Before we even saw them, before anyone saw them." Whispers rose again. Unease mingled with curiosity now. Lucas turned, nodded to Sienna gently. She stepped forward not with fear, but with a strange calmness that always made adults second-guess their instinct to protect her. She opened the sketchbook. The room hushed. Page after page, black charcoal lines, etched with startling precision. The tall, shadowy frame of Naira, posture proud, eyes unreadable. The leaner, rust-coated outline of Taro, mid-sprint, mouth open, not in snarl but warning. Soul, soft-eyed and cautious, half behind the others. "They're not just strays," Lucas continued. "They're watching, learning, surviving, and somehow connected to her." "She's a child," someone said sharply. "That doesn't make this safe." "No," Lucas agreed. "It doesn't, but it makes it worth looking deeper." A long silence. Then Mrs. Halverson, the retired librarian, cleared her throat. "We've dealt with wild animals before. We've never had a child draw them into being." "Maybe she didn't," Lucas said softly. "Maybe they were always there. Maybe they've just been waiting." Someone else called out, an older man with tremors in his voice. "You want us to wait too? Until they come onto our land?" Lucas looked him straight in the eye. "I'm asking you to look beyond the fear, to see what my granddaughter sees. what she feels. Eyes shifted to Sienna again. She wasn't scared. She wasn't hiding. She stood with the patience of someone who'd already seen the end of the story and was waiting for others to catch up. The sheriff stepped forward. "We'll monitor the area. No extermination without clear cause. That's final." His tone brokered no debate, but still, it smoldered in the room. As the crowd began to file out muttering, shaking heads, sideways glances, Lucas knelt beside Sienna. She leaned into him just slightly. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. On the floor beside them, the sketchbook remained open, and on the next blank page, as her small fingers moved with silent confidence, Sienna began to draw again. This time, she sketched a house. Not theirs. Not anyone's in town. A ridge. Trees behind it. And 3 shapes. Half in shadow, standing sentinel. Watching. Waiting. Connected. And beside them, a child. Hand outstretched not in fear, but welcome. The truck was small, dusty, and carried no markings except for a faded sticker on the bumper that read, "We're not here to tame the wild, just to understand it." It rolled into Silver Glen just past sunrise, tires crunching over gravel like the slow exhale of a long-held breath. The driver didn't rush, didn't look around for a welcoming committee. She knew there wouldn't be one. Dr. Mira Lowell stepped down from the cab and stretched, her lean frame outlined against the morning fog that hadn't yet burned off the trees. A clipboard rested beneath her arm. Her boots hit the earth with a kind of deliberate finality, not heavy, but firm, like someone who had spent more time tracking creatures than talking to people. She wore her graying hair in a low braid, practical and unassuming. Her coat was frayed at the seams, streaked with old pine sap and mud from another state, another forest. And her eyes, those quiet, unreadable eyes, scanned the landscape with the calm of someone who had long stopped expecting answers and instead learned to listen. From the porch of the sanctuary, Lucas Marin sipped burnt coffee and squinted. "That's her?" he muttered, mostly to Max, the old retriever beside him. Max gave a half-hearted wag, more out of politeness than certainty. "She's early," Lucas murmured, pressing one stiff hand against his knee as he rose. Figures. By the time he reached the gate, Mira was already scribbling notes, crouched low to examine something in the dirt. Paw prints, deep, pressed into the soft ground by heavy bodies that had circled the fence during the night. "You're Lucas Marin?" she asked without looking up. "I am. I read your file," she said, standing and brushing off her pants. "Ranger, Afghanistan, knee injury, lives with granddaughter, runs a rehab sanctuary." Lucas blinked. "Well, you've got the bullet points." Mira nodded, then turned toward the fence line. "I've also seen the footage. The girl with the dogs." His jaw tightened. "That girl is my granddaughter." "I assumed." Mira took a breath, as if tasting the air. Then she said, "Those animals, Naira, Taro, Solthair, not wild in the traditional sense, not feral, not strays. They have language, structure. I've tracked packs like them in 3 other regions, but never this organized. There's something else." Lucas crossed his arms. "The town doesn't care what they are. They're scared. They want them gone. Then the town is aiming its fear in the wrong direction." She said it without heat, without defiance. Just a quiet certainty that held more weight than any argument. From the porch, Sienna peeked through the curtain. She hadn't spoken since her mother died. Hadn't laughed or cried either. But she drew with an urgency that felt like survival. The moment she saw Mira, something flickered behind her eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or hope. Inside her room, open on the floor, was the newest page of her sketchbook. A drawing of a woman with streaked cheeks and steady eyes, crouching beside a gray dog, a hand resting just above his paw. Back outside, Lucas watched Mira pull a weather-worn folder from her truck. She handed it to him. "What's this?" "Field notes. Photographs. One of my cameras caught Naira 2 years ago in Oregon. Taro showed up later, near the border of Idaho. I think Sol's the youngest. They've been moving eastward, always together." Lucas flipped through the pages. Grainy images of wolves, dogs, something in between. In each frame, the black one Naira was always closest to the edge, like a sentinel. The red one Taro barely still, always caught, mid-motion. The gray Sol hung back, half-shadow. "They were never bred to be pets," Mira said. "And I don't think they were born in the wild either." There's something in the way they watch. It's not instinct alone. Lucas lowered the folder. You think someone made them? She hesitated. I think someone tried to break them and failed. The words settled in the air between them like frost on window squiat. Inevitable. What do you want to do? Lucas asked finally. Mira glanced toward the woods. Observe. Document. Give them space. Earn trust. They won't give it easy. They shouldn't, she said. Trust should never come easy to the hurt. At that, Lucas looked toward the house, where he knew Sienna was watching. She hadn't trusted anyone in months. And yet, those dogs. That moment, by the fence. The way Saul stepped forward, and Sienna smiled for the first time since the funeral. They didn't touch her, he murmured. Not a snarl. Not a scratch. I don't think they came here by accident, Mira said. Lucas frowned. What are you implying? She met his gaze. Sometimes, the broken find the broken. He didn't have a reply to that. Later, after Mira had set up a small camp outside the sanctuary's southern field, she placed motion-sensing cameras in a loose arc, careful not to intrude too close to the perimeter. She moved with the patience of someone who had tracked endangered species through blizzards and sandstorms alike. The town didn't know what to make of her. Word spread quickly. Some science woman with forest dirt under her nails, talking about saving beasts that should have been put down long ago. But Lucas knew better. He saw the way she walked, not as an outsider, but as someone returning to something she hadn't yet named. That night, Sienna stood barefoot on the porch again. She held her sketchbook to her chest like it was a shield or a secret. From the trees, low shapes moved between branches, nearly invisible, but she knew they were there. Max stood beside her, ears twitching. He didn't bark this time. Sienna looked to the field where Mira had lit a single lantern and was writing in the flickering glow. And in the silence that followed, not one human voice was heard. But something ancient stirred, something that didn't need words. The kitchen window faced the tree line, a silent boundary that separated the known from the unknowable. Lucas stood there every morning now, mug in hand. Not for the coffee, but for the ritual. Something about the soft scrape of the chair as Sienna pulled it beside him had become the gentlest marker of his days. She didn't speak. Not yet. But she didn't need to. That morning, she placed a folded sheet of paper on the windowsill between them. Lucas didn't reach for it at first. He let the weight of her offering settle in the quiet. Then, with a hand that still bore the fine tremors of old wounds and cold winters, he opened it. A sketch like always. But not of a wolf. Not this time. It was a structure, 4 stilts driven into the earth. A raised wooden platform about waist high, surrounded on 3 sides by planks no taller than a fence. In the middle, a single wooden bench. No nails, no rope. Just drawn in Sienna's quiet pencil lines with startling clarity. At the top, in small, careful letters, she had written, "There." Lucas stared. Is this a treehouse? Sienna shook her head, then looked toward the woods. Not a trap. Not a cage. Not even a shelter. A perch. She placed her finger lightly on the bench in the sketch, then tapped her own chest, her heart, and finally pointed outside. Toward the place she always watched. The place where the fog curled low like breath held too long. Lucas swallowed hard. You want us to build this? No nod, no confirmation. Just the steady gaze of a child who hadn't spoken in over a year, who had seen something the rest of them were too afraid to name. And in that moment, Lucas remembered the words his wife used to whisper after the war, when he'd come home shaking and half whole. Some places aren't for hiding, they're for listening. That afternoon, they began. The lumber came from the old barn, weathered, but still good. Lucas took a pencil behind his ear and a cigarette he wouldn't light, and set to measuring. Sienna sat nearby, cross-legged in the yellowing grass. The sketch balanced on her knees, like blueprints drawn in hope. Max, the old dog, stayed close. Ever since the fog thickened that week, he'd been restless, his ears twitching toward the tree line. But something about Sienna's presence seemed to calm him, or maybe he simply understood better than Lucas ever would. Hammering started slow. Lucas's joints protested each swing. Sienna offered no words, but each time he dropped a nail or paused to rub the ache from his shoulder, she passed him the next piece. quietly, like she knew this wasn't just about wood and labor, but about rebuilding something neither of them could name yet. By the third day, the platform took shape. They built it not on the path, but just shy of the clearing where Sol, Naira, and the third wolf had first appeared. Close enough to see them, far enough not to intrude. Sienna paced its distance like instinct, stopping only when she turned and gave a small, decisive nod. Lucas chuckled to himself. "You're more architect than I ever was." And still, she didn't smile. Not yet. When the last board was nailed in, Sienna climbed onto it. Lucas watched from below, heart in his throat. The way she sat, not rigid, not afraid, just still reminded him of soldiers who had finally put their rifles down and didn't quite know what to do with their hands. She placed her sketchbook beside her and looked into the trees, into the fog, into something Lucas could no longer see but somehow trusted she could. The sun slipped lower. Long shadows painted the grass in soft bruises of gold and gray. And then, as if on cue, the silence shifted. Max lifted his head. Sienna did not turn. Between the trees, just at the edge where the light fractured like glass, movement flickered. Sol. His fur caught the dying light like smoke laced in fire. Naira appeared a breath later, eyes narrowed, body half-coiled in distrust. The third, darker, quieter, lingered in the rear. They did not advance. They watched. And Sienna, from her perch, didn't flinch. She sat with her hands flat on her knees, chest rising and falling with calm, rhythmic stillness. Lucas, hidden in the thicket beyond, held his breath. Then something remarkable happened. Sienna reached into her sketchbook, pulled free a page, folded it in half and set it gently beside her on the bench. A drawing of Sol, just his eyes, rendered in a way only someone who had seen him could. Sol's ears twitched. He took one step forward, then stopped. It was enough. Sienna closed her eyes. The wind passed through her hair, lifting strands like whispered secrets. And in that suspended space between child and wolf, between silence and memory, something settled. Not understanding, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of trust. That night, Lucas poured 2 cups of tea. He didn't know why he poured the second one. Habit, maybe, or hope. Sienna didn't come inside until the stars had blinked into place. Her cheeks were cold. Her fingers smelled faintly of pine. She placed her sketchbook on the table, open to a fresh drawing. The perch bathed in starlight, with a girl and 3 shapes at its base. She pointed to the bench again. "There," she whispered. It was the first word she had spoken in 416 days. And Lucas wept, not loudly, just enough. The way you do when something long buried rises with the quiet certainty of healing. The air was thick with the hush of a dying day, when light no longer shines but hums faintly in the edges of things. Crickets began their whispered chorus beyond the trees, and a pale hush settled over the field that edged the sanctuary, where the fence met the forest like the seam between 2 forgotten stories. Sienna moved through the grass like someone who didn't need to be seen. Her boots brushed against the clover, her breath steady, eyes wide, not with fear, but with knowing the quiet kind children sometimes carry when no one listens long enough to understand what they aren't saying. She held a canvas pouch pressed to her chest. Inside were simple things, unremarkable to most. An apple imperfect, a little bruised, a pair of worn gloves, her mother's, and 3 drawings folded neatly, the edges softened from touching. One of Sol broad shoulders, head high, a streak of charcoal capturing the depth in his amber eyes. One of Taro, painted in blue tones like shadows beneath snow. And the last, of Naira, only her gaze, piercing and unfinished, as if Sienna hadn't yet figured out how to draw something that never stood still. She approached the wooden perch, the one Lucas had built, silent and solid, halfway between the fence and the tree line. It looked almost out of place there, not a structure, but an intention, a gesture, not a trap, not a lure, just a place to offer a possibility. Sienna knelt slowly, her coat brushing the grass. She placed the apple on the low shelf, its skin catching the soft gold of twilight. The gloves came next, fingers curled inward, like they still remembered hands. Then, the drawings, she weighed them down with a small, flat stone, the way her mother used to press recipes beneath a salt shaker on windy days. She didn't say anything. Not out loud, but her chest rose slowly. Her eyes lifted. Sol was there. Like always, she didn't hear him approach. One moment, the clearing was empty. The next, he stood near the tree line, ears perked, body still. The wolf dog with scars across his flank and the weary steadiness of something that had survived too much for too long. He didn't step forward, not fully, but his eyes found hers. And she felt something tighten behind her ribs, not fear, not awe, recognition. Not of him, but of the space that opened in her when he looked at her like that, a space that hadn't known it was waiting. Sienna stayed still, the way birds do when they want to be trusted. Her hand rested on her lap, fingers unconsciously mimicking the gentle curve of Sol's spine in her sketch. Sol tilted his head. Then slowly, deliberately, he stepped closer, one paw, then another, until he stood just short of the perch, close enough to sniff the apple. Close enough to let the scent of the gloves carry something old into the air. His breath fogged faintly in the cooling evening. Then he sat and watched her. She didn't move. She didn't need to. That small smile, the one Lucas hadn't seen in months, touched the corners of her mouth again, barely there. A softness, like the warmth left in a mug after the tea is gone. From behind, a rustle barely audible. Taro. He was younger, more cautious, his coat a patchwork of smoke and bark, eyes ringed with pale curiosity. He didn't approach the perch. Instead, he circled wide, keeping the edge of the clearing between them. He paused beneath an ash tree, his body low, but his eyes alert, watching Sol, then Sienna, then the perch, as if trying to decode what this strange ritual meant. Sienna turned slightly toward him but didn't reach. Just let her gaze hold him gently, like how her mother used to hold the last note of a lullaby. Then a breath colder than the rest. The wind shifted, and Sienna knew without seeing. Naira. She was presence, more than form. A shiver in the low branches, a glint near the fence's far corner. She didn't step into the clearing. She didn't need to. Her gaze pinned Sienna like a pin through paper. Not cruel, not kind, just unblinking, like she'd seen the inside of fire and come back quiet. Sienna's hands pressed flat to the ground. She closed her eyes for a moment. There was no language for this, no logic, just the rustling hush of the woods, the crackle of leaves, and the thud of her own heart, steady, open. Sol stood, sniffed the apple again, then, to her astonishment, took it gently in his jaws and walked it to the tree line. He didn't devour it. He placed it on the earth, beneath a leaning pine, as if offering it back to something deeper. Then he looked to her just once and vanished into shadow. Taro lingered a moment longer before following. Naira was gone before Sienna opened her eyes again. When Sienna returned to the house that night, Lucas was waiting on the porch. His mug sat untouched beside him, coffee gone cold. He'd seen them. From the edge of the barn, half hidden behind the hay bales, he'd watched the whole thing. Sienna didn't say a word, just climbed the steps, sat beside him, and leaned her shoulder gently against his arm. He didn't speak either, only reached out, after a moment, and placed his hand over hers. It was rough, calloused, too big, but it trembled, just slightly, from the weight of what he'd seen, or maybe from what he was beginning to believe. Inside, the dogs at the sanctuary slept deeper that night. Max stirred once, gave a soft grunt, and settled again. And out in the woods, 3 survivors lay beneath a sky full of stars, beside an apple neither eaten nor wasted a token passed between worlds. The morning light in Silver Glen came slow, filtered through the tall pines like secrets passed from branch to branch. It was the kind of light that didn't disturb, only revealed. Dew clung to the tips of grass and needles, glinting like old memories. Somewhere in the woods, a jay called out once, then fell silent. The sanctuary was still. Sienna stepped quietly along the worn path just past the fence, a basket of carefully chosen things slung gently over her shoulder. Apples, again the good kind, not too sweet. A blue glove she had found behind the barn, and a new drawing, 3 wolves, not menacing but curious, their eyes full of questions instead of hunger. She didn't tell anyone what she was doing. She didn't need to. Sol was already there. He stood at the edge of the clearing, half shadowed, half seen, like something from a story left unfinished. Sienna paused, her breath soft and even, and simply looked. She didn't call, didn't move closer. Just knelt near the perch Lucas had built, the between place, as she called it, and laid out her offerings one by one. Not as bait, not as bribes, just gifts. Gestures that asked nothing in return. Saul stepped forward. No sound. Just the creak of an old branch under his weight. His coat, dark and thick, shimmered slightly in the slanting sun. And his eyes, those impossible amber-lit eyes, never left hers. She whispered something. Not words, exactly. More like presence. A quiet understanding that came not from language, but from the spaces where language failed. From a distance, Mira watched. Her notebook was open, but she hadn't written a word. She knew better than to interrupt. There was something sacred happening here, not science, not folklore. Just the slow weaving of a thread between a girl and a creature the world wanted to forget. Taro appeared next. Younger, lighter on his feet, his gait almost curious. He hovered near the underbrush, one paw lifted, head cocked like a child overhearing a grown-up conversation. His ears twitched. Sienna didn't turn toward him. She knew he would come closer in his own time. That was the thing about trust. You couldn't hurry it. She took out the glove and placed it gently on the perch. Saul sniffed it, then sat. Not aggressively, not with dominance, just settled. Like something in him had exhaled. Behind him, circling like breath around a dying candle, was Naira. She was never quite seen, only glimpsed the flick of a white tail, the curve of a flank moving behind a tree. Her presence was like cold wind, not always visible, but always felt. Sienna didn't try to find her. She simply drew her later. That night, a sketch of a ghost wolf, more shadow than muscle, more memory than form. In the margin, she wrote one word. Why? The question wasn't about fear. It was about pain. Why did the world turn away from the things it didn't understand? The next day, the routine repeated. Sienna brought a frayed scarf. Saul touched it with his nose. Taro came a little closer, just a few feet now. He looked at her hand, tilted his head, then darted back into the trees. Mira finally took a note. Day 4. Interaction observed. Subject Saul. Steady approach, no signs of stress. Subject Taro. Skittish, but interested. Subject Naira. Behavior, unclear, potentially protective. Observation. The child acts as a tether. She underlined the last phrase. Lucas had watched from a distance, arms crossed, hat low over his brow. Something in him stirred, not quite worry, not quite pride. Maybe both. He didn't understand what was happening between Sienna and the wolves, not in words. But he saw the way her shoulders sat looser now, the way she looked up when someone spoke, instead of down. And that smile, still rare, but no longer impossible. He didn't want to break it. That night, as dusk rolled in like a tide of lilac-colored smoke, Sienna stood by the fence. Sol was there. So was Taro, just behind. The girl didn't speak. She just stood, arms at her sides, face tilted toward the breeze. It smelled like rain and pine sap. Then, slowly, so slowly, it was almost like watching a dream take shape. Sol took a step forward, then another, until he stood close enough that she could hear his breath. He didn't touch her, didn't demand. He just was. And Sienna, for the first time, reached out. Her fingers stopped an inch from his fur, hovered there. Then, with a gentleness that felt more like prayer than contact, she placed her hand on the space just between his ears. He didn't move. He closed his eyes, and for one long, holy moment, neither did she. From somewhere deep in the woods, a single howl rose, not warning, not threat. Just a note held against the silence. A song, old and aching, stitched into the fabric of the forest. And Naira, unseen, but near watched. She watched everything. The first crack came like a snapped bone through the skin of a quiet day. Sienna froze in the doorway of the barn, her hand still resting on the rusted latch. In the distance, beyond the pines, the ridge shuddered beneath a rising swell of thunderclouds, not the gentle kind that carried summer rain, but a wall of bruised blue-black rolling fast like a cavalry charge. The air changed. It smelled electric, bitter, alive. Lucas glanced up from the fence he was mending. That doesn't look right. But Sienna wasn't looking at the clouds. She was listening. There again, that sound. Not thunder. A deeper pulse, almost guttural, like something warning. She turned toward the tree line. The ridge stood still, but she could feel it. The silence before something breaks. Inside the house, Mira's laptop chirped warnings from the weather service.
Sudden supercell formation,
She read aloud, brows furrowing. Flash winds, tornado risk. But Sienna had already started walking. "Hey, hey!" Lucas shouted. "Where are you going?" She didn't answer. She just grabbed her coat off the post and started running, hair flying behind her like the tail of a comet. Her boots hit the ground with frantic rhythm through the tall grass, through the edge of the orchard, over the low stones that marked the trail. She didn't know what drove her, only that something was wrong, deeply wrong. A gust slammed the valley moments later. Dust spiraled into the sky. Trees bent. A bucket clattered across the ground like a warning bell with no church to belong to. Mira stood on the porch, hand shielding her eyes, watching the girl vanish into the veil of wind. "She's heading for the ridge," she said. Lucas swore under his breath, tossed his gloves aside, and followed. God help me if she gets herself killed. The forest had shifted. Everything smelled of ozone and pine needles torn open. Leaves twisted midair in whirlpools of motion. Birds were gone. Even the insects had fallen still. Sienna knew every foot of this path. But it looked unfamiliar now, like the land itself was bracing for something. She pressed on, stumbling once, catching herself on a broken root. The wind howled like a wild thing overhead. Her breath came hard. "Please," she whispered to the trees, to whatever stillness might be listening. "Please let them be safe." Then, as if summoned by the voice of fear itself, the first flash tore the sky open. It lit the clearing in stark silver. And there, outlined against the stone rise of the ridge, stood Sol, unmoving, watching. Behind him, shadows flitted. Taro crouched in the brambles, Naira barely visible beneath a cedar's low boughs, her eyes like pale lanterns in the dark. The platform there shuddered in the wind, but it stood. Sienna's eyes locked with Sol's. His fur rippled against the gusts, but he didn't flinch, didn't run. Another crack split the world. This one struck a tree barely 20 yards away. Bark exploded. The air burned white. Sienna dropped to her knees from the force of it, palms digging into the wet moss. Sol turned sharply, not from fear, but with purpose. His head lifted, ears back. He was not afraid for himself. He was afraid for her. That's when she realized he'd stayed to wait for her. She rose slowly, heart pounding. "Come on," she said aloud. "Come on, we have to go." A low growl answered. Naira had stepped forward now, muscles taut, distrust burning in her eyes like ancient fire. But Taro, silent, wounded-eyed Taro, took a step in Sienna's direction. Then another. Sol barked once. A command. And they hesitated. The wind turned again. A branch snapped above Sienna. It struck the ground inches from her feet. "Move!" came Lucas's voice, far behind. Sienna's throat clenched. "Please," she begged the shadows. "Please don't stay here." She dropped to one knee, pulled something from her coat pocket, her sketchbook. Pages fluttered wildly in the wind as she flipped it open. She tore one out, then another. She pressed them flat on the platform. One was a drawing of Sol, eyes calm, standing there beneath a summer sun. One was of Taro, curled in sleep beneath ivy. And the last was of Naira. Not as she was now, but younger, unscarred, before whatever had happened to harden her into shadow. Sienna backed away from the platform. Her hand trembled. "You're not monsters," she whispered. "You're what's left." Then, as if in answer, Sol moved. He stepped onto the platform, just for a second, long enough to nose the page drawn in his image. Then he turned and trotted to Sienna's side, brushing past her leg. Not a claim, a promise. Taro followed, warily. He didn't touch her, but he didn't run. And from the shadows, a single long howl pierced the air. Naira's voice, ancient, mournful, and then she vanished. Lucas arrived breathless, eyes wide at the sight. "What? In God's name?" The trees bent deeper now. Another burst of lightning threw the world into day for a second. "We have to go," Mira called from behind, hand outstretched. Sienna nodded, guiding Sol gently with her steps. He followed without a leash. Taro limped beside. The wind screamed, but they moved girl and ghosts and memory back toward the edge of the storm. At the last rise, Sienna looked back. There still stood, pages flapping like flags over a grave. And in the clearing's heart, where thunder had not touched, the earth remained still as if it remembered something worth protecting. The woods were different in the rain. Where once they had hummed with the low, steady rhythm of wind through pine needles and the chirp of unseen birds, now they groaned and shifted. Trees bent like old men in pain. Water coursed down every slope, pooling in the hollows. Thunder cracked again, raw and close, sending flocks from hidden roosts into the churning sky. Sienna pushed through the underbrush, soaked through and breathless. Her hood had blown back miles ago. Pine needles clung to her damp cheeks, but she didn't stop not even to blink the stinging water from her eyes. She knew where they'd be. That's what her heart whispered. Not her mind, not her maps just, that quiet voice she had learned to follow in recent weeks. The same voice that told her to kneel the first time Sol had crept toward her. The same voice that helped her sense Naira even when she was invisible in the trees. Now, it was leading her straight toward them. A branch cracked in the dark. She flinched. Then she saw them. At the base of a rock ledge, half buried in pine and fog, 3 silhouettes huddled beneath a large fallen tree. Sol was closest to the edge, head raised as if sensing her approach. Taro lay beside him, pressed low, tail curled tightly beneath his hind legs. The third shape hovered like smoke Naira, silent and still, her yellow eyes catching just enough of the stormlight to glow. They didn't move. Sienna stopped several feet away, heart pounding in her ribs. Then she did the only thing she could think of. She sat. Right there, in the mud and needles, legs folded beneath her, arms limp at her sides. Rain pelted her jacket. Lightning flashed behind her, lighting the branches like skeletal fingers. She didn't speak, didn't reach out. She just breathed slow, steady, loud enough for them to hear over the storm. Sol was the first to move. Not much, just the lowering of his head. Then a step forward. Another. His eyes never left hers. He stopped a foot away, dripping wet, and sat. She reached out her hand, not to touch, but just to offer. It shook, not from fear, but the cold that had begun creeping up her spine. He leaned forward and rested his muzzle against her palm. A breath hitched in her throat. She closed her fingers gently, letting them curl around the soaked fur of his cheek. He didn't pull away. Behind him, Taro stood, still trembling, still cautious, but less rigid now. He looked at Sol, then at her, then slowly made his way forward until he pressed against Sol's side. Then came Naira. Not a sound, no footfall. She simply emerged from the shadows like mist. Her coat, dark as wet charcoal, clung to her narrow frame. Her eyes were unreadable, but Sienna saw something else in them tonight, not challenge, but recognition. Sienna didn't move. Naira walked past her, circled once, and sat just behind her left shoulder. Not too close, but close enough to share her shelter from the wind. That's when Sienna realized they were waiting for her, not the other way around. She blinked, and for a second the tears mixed with rain on her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall. In the distance, the storm roarette's voice growing thinner, stretched out by distance. They sat like that for what felt like hours, 4 soaked bodies in the middle of a wild place, huddled not for warmth but for something deeper, a fragile communion neither human nor canine could name. It was Sol who stood first. He stepped back, gave a low huff that stirred mist in the air, and looked toward the path that led down the ridge. Sienna followed his gaze. She rose slowly, testing her legs, which had numbed from cold. "Okay," she whispered, unsure if she meant it for them or for herself. "Let's go." Sol moved first. Taro followed at his flank. Naira remained a moment longer. Then, like wind through ferns, she too moved, her body blending with the falling rain. And then Sienna began walking, leading the way down the ridge, through the waterlogged trees, through the place that used to be dangerous and now, for some reason, felt like home. They stayed behind her, 3 shadows. At first she thought they were simply following instinct, but now there was rhythm to it. A silent decision. They chose to follow her. That was the difference. They reached the clearing near the lower tree line where Amira had once set up a motion camera tucked behind brush. It blinked red now, recording. Somewhere, from a distance perhaps in the ranger station, perhaps already on Mira's feed, this moment was being saved. A girl leading wolves through a storm. Not with fear, not with force, just quiet understanding. Sienna turned, slowly. Sol stopped just behind her. She knelt and whispered, "Thank you." He stepped forward, touched his nose to her collarbone just for a moment. Then they vanished. Not in a burst, not like ghosts, but with the grace of something that had always belonged to the wild. Sol, then Taro, then Naira, gone. Sienna stood there for a long time after they disappeared, letting the wind pass through her, letting the silence return. And somewhere, deep in the heart of Silver Glen, the people who had once whispered about danger, who had once feared what they didn't understand, would see what a storm could not destroy. Abund. Quiet. Unshakable. Real. Morning didn't so much arrive in Silver Glen as it crept in quiet, hesitant, the way light filters into a room where something sacred has just happened. The storm had passed, but its fingerprint remained on everything. Branches littered the roads. A downed wire hissed faintly at the corner of Main and Cedar, but it wasn't the wreckage that silenced the town. It was the footage. At dawn, Sheriff Brandt received the USB drive slid beneath his office door. No note, no signature, just that single black drive, still damp with rain. When he plugged it into his laptop and saw what it held, his fingers stilled, breath catching in his throat like he'd swallowed something too large. 3 wolves know, dog shaking beneath a pine canopy, wide-eyed and wild. A girl, maybe 15, maybe less, stepping into the chaos of wind and flashing light like it didn't matter. Sienna. No words, just her presence. Her slow kneel, the way Sol came to her first. Taro, next. And Naira didn't come close, but the camera caught her pause, the tilt of her head, that impossible stillness that wasn't fear, but consideration, as if watching a ceremony, not a child. And then the walk, Sienna leading, the dogs flanking her like shadows reborn. The thunder cracked, trees bent, rain whipped sideways, but they followed. When Brandt showed it at Town Hall, no one spoke. There were no chairs arranged for a meeting that morning. People just stood shoulder to shoulder, dirt on their boots, steam rising from coffee cups clutched in both hands like armor. The footage played on a grainy projector screen hung in front of the faded county seal. No voiceover, no music, just the sound of wind and footsteps in wet grass. Mira stood near the back, her clipboard forgotten at her side. She hadn't slept, not because of fear, but because she'd known this moment would come, the one where science fell quiet and something older, softer, took its place. Reverence. That was the word that filled the room now, even from men who still smelled of diesel and doubt. Even from women who'd whispered prayers that these things would just vanish. When the video ended, nobody clapped. Nobody moved. Sienna stood at the front, slightly off to the side, her clothes still wrinkled from the night before. Mud up to her knees, hair tangled. She hadn't asked to be there. Lucas had driven her in while she clutched a single drawing to her chest sole's face, sketched in pencil, lines so fine they looked like breath. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to, because this was louder than any speech, sharper than any appeal. Sheriff Brandt cleared his throat. The footage was not staged, no bait, no containment. He looked directly at the man who had once demanded traps. No bullets either. That man Granger folded his arms, but didn't speak. He looked at Sienna instead, and something in his jaw loosened. Mira finally stepped forward, her boots thudding gently against the floor. "I spent 2 weeks trying to collect data on those dogs," she said, voice steady. "Every time I moved closer, they moved away. They don't want our food. They don't seek out our homes. But Sienna, she gave them something we didn't." Lucas, standing behind her, added quietly, "She gave them presence." Mira nodded. Not dominance, not control, just presence. And they responded with trust. A murmur moved through the crowd like a leaf caught in a breeze. Not anger this time, not fear. Brandt let the silence hang, then leaned forward slightly. "So what do we do, folks? Keep aiming guns at what we don't understand? Or maybe we listen for once." Mrs. Kelton Widow, gardener, known for her sharp tongue, spoke without lifting her eyes. If a child can kneel in a storm, maybe we can stop shouting. There was nothing triumphant in the room. No victory declared. Just a shift, quiet as snowmelt. A willingness to see with different eyes. Outside, Sienna sat on the front steps of Town Hall, her drawing now resting on her lap. She traced the edge of Sol's ear with her fingertip, over and over. She didn't know what had changed inside that room. Not really. But she felt something settle, like soil tamped gently over roots. Lucas stepped beside her. "They're still scared," he said. "The town, I mean." "I know," she murmured. "But not of the dogs anymore," he added, sitting beside her. "They're scared of being wrong." She looked up at him, eyes as steady as they'd been on the ridge. "Being wrong is how you begin again." He smiled at that. Not big, not flashy, just enough to feel. From across the street, Mira watched the two of them. And even though her heart still beat like a drum inside her ribs from everything she'd seen, she knew one thing for certain. The town had come to the edge of something and stepped back, just enough to see the forest. Reverence, she thought again. But reverence was never without risk. The meeting wasn't loud. That was the strange part. No shouting, no fists on the table. Just the heavy hush of a town caught between instinct and evidence, fear and wonder. The chairs in the council hall groaned as folks shifted uncomfortably. Outside, the summer air hung dense, too warm for the season, like the sky itself was waiting to break. Sheriff Carson stood by the window, arms crossed, his thumb rubbing a blister near the base of his palm. Mira sat 2 seats down from Lucas, notebook closed on the table, fingers folded neatly atop the leather cover. Sienna was absent, but the town could feel her, like pine resin clinging to the air long after the tree is cut. Mayor Greeley cleared his throat. The sound cracked. "So here's where we stand," he said. "You've got 2 weeks." Silence. 2 weeks, he repeated. No traps, no bullets, no removal teams. He glanced toward the sheriff. "This isn't consensus. It's pause." Someone shifted. A woman from the bakery, Nancy, maybe murmured, "God help us all." Lucas didn't flinch. He looked tired in a quiet, buried way, like the kind of exhaustion that doesn't show in your limbs but seeps into the places where faith lives. "What happens after 2 weeks?" Mira asked, voice calm as river water. Greeley looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Then we vote again. By then, I expect more than sympathy sketches and camera reels." Someone scoffed. It might have been Dale Cooper, the cattleman who'd lost 3 ewes. He looked like he wanted to spit, but thought better of it. Lucas spoke, finally. "They didn't run when the storm hit. They stayed. With her." His words were low, measured. "I saw it. You saw it. They're still wild," someone muttered. "And yet," Mira said, opening her notebook, "not feral." The word seemed to hover, unfamiliar. She continued, "I've reviewed the footage. Their response to Sienna wasn't just proximity. It was orientation, deference, recognition." "That ain't science," Cooper growled. "No," Mira said softly. "That's behavior. Science is what helps us not ignore it." A long pause. Sheriff Carson finally spoke, gravel deep in his throat. "The question now is, do we leave the dogs alone, or do we make enemies of them?" His words settled like ash. 2 weeks, Greeley repeated. "Starting today." The gavel didn't fall hard. It didn't need to. Outside, the town moved in half steps. Shopkeepers kept one eye on the ridgeline. Children were told not to go near the orchard trail. Hunters loaded their trucks, but left rifles at home, grumbling as they did. Even the dogs' domestic ones barked less, as if they too sensed something unspoken curling beneath the surface of the glen. Lucas drove home in silence. Sienna sat in the passenger seat, sketchbook on her lap, thumb smudging charcoal into soft edges. "You okay?" he asked gently. She didn't answer, not with words, but her pencil paused, and her eyes stayed on the drawing 3 silhouettes under wind-bent trees, one of them smaller than the others. Sol, Taro, and Naira. Lucas watched her, then returned his eyes to the road. There was nothing more to ask. Not yet. Later that evening, Mira sat on the cabin steps with a mug of coffee growing cold in her hands. The sky above Silver Glen had turned a strange kind of lavender, Wind danced through the trees with no rhythm, like a whisper searching for someone who no longer lived there. She heard the pad of feet on gravel. Lucas approached with slow, unhurried steps. "They'll come down again," she said before he could speak. "The dogs. I know." Mira looked at him. "You trust her, Sienna?" He nodded. "Like I trust the mountain to be the mountain. She doesn't need to prove anything." She took a sip of her coffee, now bitter and lukewarm. "She might be the only one who doesn't—" A branch snapped somewhere in the woods. Both of them turned, listening, but the night held. The next morning, Mira hiked early. Recorder in one pocket, pepper spray in the other, not for the wolves, but for the thing she couldn't explain. Her boots left faint marks in the dew-glazed moss as she followed the narrow ridge trail above the perch. There were new prints there, paw-shaped, damp from recent rain. She crouched and touched the ground with 2 fingers, still cool, recent. The platform Sienna had named There stood in the clearing below. A bowl of water had been nudged sideways. A glove was missing. In its place, something left behind. A feather. Black, sleek, curved like a crescent moon. Not from a bird. She stared at it for a long time. That afternoon, a quiet unease settled over the grocery, the gas station, even the church. Rumors began threading their way through the cracks. That the dogs had moved closer. That someone's garbage had been untouched out of respect or warning. No one was sure. That a boy down near Wexler's farm swore he saw one of them big ones watching the field from the tree line, but it didn't move. Just waited. Waited for what? No one dared answer. 2 weeks. It sounded like mercy. It tasted like countdown. Lucas stood on his porch that night, arms crossed, dog at his feet. Not their dog, just a shepherd from next door that kept coming over now. Lingering. The mountains were dark, the kind of dark that felt heavy. He didn't light the lantern, just watched the trees. And waited. It came just after dawn. The kind of morning where fog curled low and slow over the edge of the pine thickets, muting even the birdsong. Lucas had just finished tying back the last of the wire fencing on the south trail. His fingers chilled but steady. When it happened, a crack of sound too sharp, too deliberate to be mistaken. A gunshot, then another. The echoes rolled like thunder against the hills, breaking the hush like a fist through glass. Lucas dropped the pliers in his hand, heart spiking, eyes darting toward the ridge. Far above, the trees stirred as if startled. Somewhere in that stillness, a shape flinched. Taro. The young dog had been watching from a rocky outcrop, still half wild, cautious even in comfort. Now, the sound had split him apart, the gunfire slicing through memory, instinct, and fear like a blade. Lucas's breath caught. From that distance, he couldn't hear the sound Taro made, but later, Mira would describe it as a cry that wasn't just animal, wasn't just pain, something in between. Like it came from a wound deeper than muscle or skin. He ran. Branches whipped at his arms as he pushed through brush, skidding on wet soil, boots catching in roots. By the time he cleared the gully near the stream bed, Mira was already running from the other side, her camera slung behind her like it no longer mattered. They found him tangled in a patch of rusted barbed wire where the old cattle boundary used to be. One front leg twisted beneath him, blood soaking into the dead grass. Taro didn't fight. He didn't growl. He only whimpered low, broken, eyes wide and full of something that looked too much like betrayal. Lucas dropped to his knees without a word. "It's okay," he murmured, voice thick. "We've got you." His hand shook as he pried back the wire, careful not to pull. Mira was already pulling bandages from her pack, but neither of them could keep from glancing toward the tree line, where the shots had come from. Hunters. Early-season poachers, maybe? Strays from the edge counties who didn't care for permits or promises. It didn't matter now. The damage was done. Taro's paw was sliced deep near the pad. Another gash curled around his flank where the wire had caught him mid-bolt. And through it all, the dog didn't once lash out, only stared at Lucas like he wanted to believe this wouldn't end the way it had before. Lucas knew that look. It haunted his dreams. Mira pressed gauze gently to the wound, her touch more reverent than clinical. "I told them," she whispered. "No guns, no pressure. We still have time." Lucas didn't answer, his jaw locked tight. The dog trembled in his arms. Behind them, the pine trees held their breath, and somewhere beyond, Naira's shadow circled unseen but unmistakable. The matriarch wolf was near, watching, protecting, or mourning. Sienna arrived only minutes later, breathless, her coat half-buttoned, sketchbook still under one arm like she hadn't even paused to put it down. When she saw the blood, she froze. Then, quietly, she knelt beside Taro. No words. Just a palm pressed gently to his side, her eyes full and glassy. He let out a sigh at her touch. Not relief. Something older. Recognition. Like in her presence, the storm of noise and wire and memory dimmed just enough for him to stay. Lucas caught Mira's glance, the silent, pained agreement passing between them. This couldn't happen again. The town had 2 weeks, but trust didn't wait on calendars. One shot was all it took to undo the unspoken peace they'd spent months weaving between 2 species. Sienna opened her sketchbook. She turned to a page, not a drawing of a wolf. Not today, but a picture of a barn with a red ribbon on the door. Something safe. A home. She set it down beside Taro, as if it were an offering. The dog looked once, blinked, then rested his head on her knee. For a long time, no one spoke. The birds had stopped singing. Even the wind held its tongue. Then, in the distance, a figure emerged from the tree-line rifle slung carelessly, a blaze-orange cap atop greasy hair. He froze when he saw the group, eyes narrowing at the side of the camera still hanging from Mira's shoulder. "I didn't shoot no dog," he barked across the clearing. Lucas stood slowly. "You fired." He ran. "That's enough." The man scoffed, turned, and melted back into the trees without another word. But Sienna watched the space he left behind, like it might still burn. Mira stepped closer to Lucas. "They'll say it was an accident, that we're overreacting." He didn't answer. The silence said enough. As they lifted Taro gently onto the canvas stretcher, Sienna walked beside them, one hand still resting on the dog's fur, the other gripping the sketchbook as though the paper inside could somehow hold the seams of this moment together. In the shadow of the ridge, the pines stood still, and the echoes of the gunshot lingered in the hollows, not just as sound, but as memory. Not just fear, but warning. The balance had cracked. And the wolves, like the people of Silver Glen, would not forget. Night settled over the ridge in muted blues, the kind of dark that seemed to drink every sound except the hush of distant creek water. In the open doorway of the barn, a single lantern cast a slow-moving halo. Inside, straw smelled of rain and iron. Somewhere beyond the stables, a thunderhead still grumbled like a sore tooth. Taro lay on a canvas pallet beneath the lantern's glow, flank wrapped in fresh gauze. His chest rose in short, uneven bursts exhaustion, more than pain, but each flick of his ears betrayed how thin the margin was between calm and flight. Lucas knelt nearby, rinsing blood from a pair of wire cutters. Mira cataloged vitals in a soft murmur only the horses could hear. Sienna hovered at the stall door, clutching her sketchbook tight enough that her knuckles blanched. She'd washed, but mud still ringed her cuffs. The pencils in her pocket clinked with every shiver she couldn't suppress. Yet her eyes, those wide, cedar green eyes, never left Taro. Outside, a shape moved. Naira. She stood just beyond the threshold, half-lit by lantern spill, black coat slick with drizzle, shoulders square, gaze pinned to the wounded dog. Wind combed the fur along her spine, but she neither advanced nor retreated. It was a warrior's stillness, one Lucas recognized from battlefields where loyalty and suspicion rode the same hard edge. "Sienna," Mira whispered. "She's guarding him." The girl nodded once and stepped into the light. Taro's head lifted, tension rippling through every muscle, but Sienna sank to her knees, an arm's length away, and opened her book with care. The paper crackled small, familiar thunder. She turned past charcoal studies of pine and storm clouds, past hurried sketches of Sol dozing by the perch, until she reached a page near the center. She held it up. Lantern light kissed graphite. 3 dogs curled around a sleeping child beneath an enormous white pine, stars pricking the sky like pinholes in velvet. Taro's ears perked. Naira shifted her weight, but didn't growl. Her eyes tracked the drawing, then Sienna's face, then back again as if comparing the promise on paper with the fragile truth before her. Sienna's voice, when it came, was little more than breath. "Home," she said, and pointed to the pine she had shaded with painstaking crosshatch. Safe. Lucas set the wire cutters down. He'd removed every visible barb, but a final loop of rusty strand still pinched Taro's fetlock, too tight for fingers and too close to bone for pliers without another pair of hands. He looked to Mira, then to Naira framing the door, then finally to the girl with the drawing. Sienna, he said softly, I need to finish this. He'll bolt if we startle him. She understood. Sliding forward on her knees, she laid the sketch flat before Taro, palms up in surrender. The dog's nostrils fluttered. He nosed the page once, twice, whiskers brushing starlight rendered in pencil. A tremor passed through his frame pane, memory, something older, but he did not snap. Naira stepped inside. 1, deliberate stride. 2, her hackles rose, yet she stayed silent, watching Sienna touch Taro's muzzle with 3 fingertips. Feather-light permission asked, and, astonishingly, granted. Lucas met Mira's eyes. Ready? Mira knelt opposite him. Steady hands braced on Taro's shoulder. Sienna whispered again nonsense syllables, gentler than lullabies. Saul's name, Taro's name, maybe Naira's too. The barn itself seemed to lean closer, holding its breath. Lucas slid the slim nose of the cutters beneath the wire loop. Taro flinched. Sienna pressed her palm to his cheek, voice a thread of calm. It's okay. It's okay. Naira's lips peeled back a fraction, a warning poised. But Sienna turned the drawing toward her see, and the great black head dipped by an inch, uncertainty warring with trust newly born. Click. The wire snapped free. Blood welled, then slow ate a clean cut at last. Mira eased the gauze higher, rapping, nodding. Taro sagged, eyes half closed, and in that surrender Lucas felt the barn's timbers exhale. Then the moment sharpened into something more. Taro pushed up painfully, pressed his cold nose against Sienna's wrist-tone heartbeat, 2 before laying his muzzle across the back of her hand. Gratitude, offered in the only language he owned. Sienna's lashes shimmered. She didn't cry, she breathed, and smiled, small, luminous, the kind that plants green shoots in the cracks of grief. Behind her, Naira stepped closer, Lucas' ten-stalled instincts flaring, but the she-dog bypassed him entirely, easing down to curl her body against Taro's good side, a silent sentinel. Sienna lifted the sketch again, turned it in Naira's direction. The wolf dog sniffed the graphite pine, the penciled stars, then, slowly, almost imperceptibly rested her massive paw over the corner of the page, anchoring it to the straw. Mira swallowed. She accepts it, she whispered. Not a contract, not capitulation, just a covenant of momentary peace, fragile yet real. A camera mounted in the rafters, the same one that had caught Sienna guiding them through the storm-blinked red. It captured the lantern glow on Sienna's smile, the wire still clutched in Lucas's fist like a spent serpent, Naira's protective curve, Taro's trust. Tomorrow, when the council would demand updates, when the hunters might grumble about lost kills and wasted ammo, Lucas would show them this frame. 1 image, a child, 2 scarred dogs, and a drawing nobody dared believe until now. But tonight, he simply sat back in the straw, chest tight, with something dangerously close to hope. Mira closed her notebook without writing. Some data you carried only in your ribs. Outside, dawn began edging the horizon, pale gold dripping beneath leftover storm clouds. Saul trotted into view at the doorway, shook rain from his coat, and slipped beside Naira with a low rumble of comfort. 3 dogs, 1 girl, and on the straw between them, a sketch of a peace not yet promised, but suddenly, achingly possible. Dawn broke like a breath held too long. The ridge wore its thin veil of mist, edges blurring where pine met sky. In the clearing beyond there, dew-pearled grass glittered under the first shards of sun. Sienna was already there alone, or as alone as a girl could be, with the forest listening. She sat cross-legged on the platform Lucas had built, knees hugged to her chest, sketchbook closed beside her as if words were unnecessary this morning. Her coat, 2 sizes big, slouched around her shoulders. Pale strands of hair floated in the breeze. Behind her, a thermos steamed quietly. Nothing else moved, but the trees were not empty. Out between the trunks, shapes circled a flick of russet tail, a ripple of gray. Sol and Taro paced in a drifting figure 8, restless but calm. They kept their distance, as if aware this moment was not theirs to claim. Today belonged to the shadow that lingered just beyond the sun-touched line where day began. Nira. She watched from a slight rise, half hidden under a cedar bough blackened by old lightning. Her stance was carved from caution and resolve. Head lifted, ears alert. For weeks she had watched Sienna, circled Sienna, protected Sienna's silence without inviting her own. Now something shifted subtle as a stone tilting in the riverbed. She stepped forward. Sienna lifted her gaze. There were perhaps 30 feet between them. A breath. 1,000 years. Wind sighed through the needles. Soul halted, gaze snapping to Naira, then back to Sienna, checking, measuring, ready to intercede. Taro crouched low, amber eyes pinned to his queen. But Naira did not look at them. All her attention lay on the child, waiting in stillness. Another step. Sienna's pulse hammered in her ears. She could feel it, could hear it, yet she didn't move. Lucas had taught her once, in the long winter after the funeral, to breathe like the earth, slow, deep, unbroken. She breathed that way now, letting the rhythm of it spread from her ribs out to her fingertips. Naira crossed the final span of dew. Sunlight struck her coat and revealed threads of charcoal and deep brown, scars faint under the fur like rivers beneath ice. She stopped at the foot of the platform, chest heaving once, nostrils flaring to read the air that clung to Sienna's skin sawdust, graphite, apple. Sienna lowered one boot to the plank as if granting permission. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't even blink. She simply waited, allowing the moment to name itself. Naira climbed. The boards creaked under her weight too. 3 measured steps until the space between wolfdog and girl was a single breath. Sienna could smell the wild on her. Damp leaves, iron, a faint trace of distant storms. Heat pooled in Sienna's throat. Not fear, but the vastness of being seen by something ancient. Naira reached out. Not a nip, not dominance. Her nose touched Sienna's shoulder in almost imperceptible graze, as if checking for solidity. Sienna exhaled through parted lips. The warmth of Naira's breath seeped through fabric, into skin, into bone. A spark lit, small but sure. Inside the hollows, grief had hollowed out. The queen's head lowered. Not in surrender. Sienna understood that instantly. This was not subservience. It was acknowledgement, the way mountains bow only to the sky that holds them. Naira's shoulders eased. The tension along her spine unspooled. She angled her head so that the top of her skull pressed gently beneath Sienna's Chinan invitation, forged from courage and memory. Something cracked open inside the girl soft, brilliant, unstoppable. Tears slid down her cheeks, silent as morning dew. Her fingers rose, hovered, then settled into the thick fur behind Naira's ears. It was coarse and soft, all at once, like touching the rough side of comfort. Naira closed her eyes. Soul chuffed low, circling once before lying at the foot of the platform. Taro crept closer, tail relaxed, then settled with a wary sigh. Around them, the forest exhaled. Birds resumed their timid warble, as though daylight finally earned permission. Hidden in the underbrush 20 yards off, Mira watched through a camera lens, finger frozen above the shutter. She had chased evidence her entire life tracks in snow, DNA swabs on fence twists, but nothing had prepared her for the purity of this image. Grief meeting dignity, wild meeting wounded, neither conquering the other. Click. One frame. Enough. Behind Mira, Lucas stood, shoulders squared yet eyes wet. He whispered, "They chose her." He did not clarify whether he meant the dogs or the gods. In that instant, it felt like the same thing. Sienna stroked Naira's fur once more, then drew back. Naira lifted her head, gazing into the girl's eyes. What passed between them held no language, but it echoed like thunder beneath the heart. Slowly, Sienna opened her sketchbook to a blank page, tore it free, and placed it on the platform. From her pocket, she drew a stub of charcoal. Naira watched, still and royal, as Sienna traced a line 2 curved bodies, black and smaller, gray sleeping against a larger shape, dark as midnight but gentle in slope. Around them, Sienna drew tall pines, a single star above. She set the stub down, blew lightly to clear stray dust, then pushed the drawing toward Naira, palm flat behind it. Naira sniffed, Then, delicate as snowfall, she lay her paw atop the page, not scratching, not marking, claiming. A bow returned. Recognition accepted. The sun rose higher, gold spilling across needle and plank, catching in Sienna's tears until they glittered like molten glass. She wiped them away with the back of her wrist and laughed, soundless, breathy, bright. The first laugh since before the river, before the silence, before the world had split. Lucas felt that laugh in his marrow. Mira, lowering her camera, felt it in the steadiness of her pulse. Sol's ear twitched. Taro's eyes softened. And Naratha, queen of the wild, stood a little taller, though she bowed no more. She had spoken in the only way she knew. I see you. I guard you. We go forward together. In the hush between sunbeams, Sienna touched her own heart, then Naira's chest. One beat, two lives. No promise spoken, but something deeper sealed. The forest bore witness. And for the first time, the ridge felt less like a boundary and more like a beginning. Saturday markets in Silver Glen were usually subdued affairs. Jars of choke, cherry jam lined in crooked rows, quilts draped over tailgates, babies balanced on hips while their parents bartered for early corn. It was comfort in repetition, the kind of ritual that told people the world still turned the way it always had. That illusion unraveled shortly after 10. A battered county pickup rumbled to the curb, dust pluming behind it. Mayor Greeley climbed out with Sheriff Carson and 2 council members in tow. No announcement, no sirens, just a quiet inspection tour meant to gauge the mood of the townsfolk as the 2-week truce reached its midpoint. They didn't expect to find the pasture full of silence. The market chatter faded the moment heads turned east toward Marinland. Hands stilled over strawberries. A stack of seed packets slipped from Mrs. Kelton's grasp, scattering like birds. What people saw stopped words in their throats. A young girl, straw hat bobbing against the sun, walking an open strip of field, and behind her, 3 German shepherds pacing in a loose V. Not lunging, not hurting, merely following. Sienna's steps were slow, almost rhythmic boots brushing seed grass, fingertips trailing the tops of Queen Anne's lace. Sol padded nearest, his gait easy, despite the faint scar still pink along his shoulder. Taro guarded the flank, ears twitching at every distant hammer of hoof or engine. And Naira took the rear, regal and deliberate, as if her paws measured each yard of earth the humans thought they owned. A gasp fluttered through the crowd. "That can't be real," whispered Ellie from the diner porch. "It is," muttered old Dan, tipping his cap lower. "Saw it with my own eyes at dawn. Thought I was dreamin'." Mayor Greeley swallowed. "Sheriff, your men?" Carson raised a hand weight. The sheriff had spent bullet-scarred years learning the timbre of dangerous stillness. This was not that. What vibrated across the field was something quieter, like the hush inside a chapel when the first chord of an organ hums. Sienna stopped beside a lone cottonwood, its early autumn leaves flickering coins of gold. She dropped to one knee and opened her sketchbook on the ground. The wind tried to flip pages, but Naira moved forward, placing a single paw on the corner to hold them steady, the same gesture witnessed by Lucas and captured on Mira's camera earlier that week. A collective shiver ran through the onlookers. Sienna drew. Quick strokes, charcoal staining her fingertips. Sol sat, nose inches from the page, watching the lines form. Taro's tail thumped once in the grass, as if some part of him recognized himself in the graphite shadows. Naira lifted her head and looked straight across the pasture, straight at the town. Eye lines collided. People who'd spent months demonizing the she-dog felt something slip behind their ribs, fear displaced by respect, maybe even guilt. Lucas emerged from the barn then, wiping grease from his hands. He hadn't planned any demonstration, but he didn't rush to intervene either. Instead, he offered a small nod to Sienna, a silent, "You're safe," and turned to face the growing crowd, with shoulders squared but relaxed. Mira, camera dangling at her hip, joined him. She tracked the townsfolk's faces the way she once documented wildlife migration looking for signs of shift. And there it was, subtle in the set of jaws unclenching, the lowering of rigid shoulders, the easing of hands once curled into fists. "Look," a teenager murmured, pointing. Sienna had finished the sketch. 3 dogs curled around the trunk of the cottonwood, their bodies forming a crescent that sheltered a smaller figure herself beneath branches heavy with stars. Above them, she'd added something new. Tiny human silhouettes at a distance, watching with lanterns in their hands. The unexpected tenderness of it caught even the cynics off guard. Sienna tore the page free, folded it, and set it at the cottonwood's base like an offering. Then she stood, brushed off her knees, and without a backward glance, started toward the fence that bordered town property. The dogs rose as one. Every step closer lifted the hush 2 decibels. Mothers pulled children fractionally behind skirts. Men who'd sworn to take care of the problem themselves found their boots suddenly rooted. Yet Sienna's pace never faltered. At the fence line, she paused, resting her palm on the sun-warmed rail. Sol came up beside her, nudging her elbow. Taro sniffed the wind. Naira remained just inside sanctuary land, tail low but eyes clear. Sienna turned to the assembled town. No speech, no wave, just that small, quiet smile that had begun to haunt Silver Glen in the best possible way. Her actions filled the void words once occupied. See, the smile said. They chose gentleness when we offered it. And then she stepped back, guiding the dogs with a tilt of her shoulders, no leash, no spoken cue. They followed, returning to the cottonwood shade, leaving the fence and the people untouched. Something shifted then, audible, like a sigh escaping collective lungs. Mayor Greeley found his voice first. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "looks orderly." Ellie exhaled a laugh halfway between relief and disbelief. "Orderly as miracles get," she whispered. Sheriff Carson laid a hand on the mayor's arm. "We should let him be," he advised, not bothering to hide the reverence lining his words. Greeley nodded. 2 weeks, he repeated quietly. But the phrase no longer sounded like a deadline. It sounded like a window one, swinging wider with every tentative heartbeat of the valley. On their walk back to market stalls and produce scales, people spoke softer, as if they'd left a piece of themselves at that fence. Some glanced over shoulders, expecting, maybe hoping to see the girl and her unlikely honor guard still watching. They didn't. Sienna sat beneath the cottonwood again, head bent over a new page. The dogs settled around her sole's chin on her boot. Taro curled half-moon against her back. Naira poised like a sentinel, but blinking slow, content. Across the pasture, the town of Silver Glen regained its voice, but it was different now, modulated by something fragile and bright. Not everyone understood what had changed, but everyone felt it. The early morning light spilled into the cabin like a quiet apology. It softened the sharp edges of the past days, the barbed wire wound on Taro's flank, now wrapped in gauze, the uneasy peace that lay like a blanket too thin to warm anyone. Outside, frost clung to the pasture grasses, giving everything a silver hush. But inside, something warmer stirred. Sienna sat cross-legged on the braided rug by the hearth, a blunt pencil in her hand, her fingers smudged with graphite. Her hair still tangled, still wild, hung around her face like a veil. The fire hadn't yet been lit, but she didn't seem to mind the chill. Beside her lay a wrinkled pad of paper, the top sheet almost filled. Lucas watched from the doorway, one shoulder resting against the frame, holding his breath like he might startle the moment if he exhaled too loudly. He didn't speak. He just stood there, waiting, learning. The dogs were in their usual places, not caged, not commanded, but present. Taro lay nearest to her, the dressing on his legs stark against his dark coat. He lifted his head once, as if checking in, and then let it rest again. Mira and Naira lay farther back, closer to the rear door, but their eyes tracked Sienna's every movement, as if her pencil lines meant something they too could read. Lucas cleared his throat softly. Drawing again? Sienna didn't nod, didn't look up. She simply moved her pencil in a slow arc, completing the curve of something only she could see. A beat passed, then another. Lucas stepped inside, careful with his boots on the rug. "Can I see?" Still nothing. He crouched down beside her, slow and deliberate, like one might approach a deer drinking from a still creek. His knees popped. He was older than he used to be, though the mirror had tried to lie, and he winced just slightly. Then Sienna turned the page toward him. The drawing was soft, nearly ghost-like in its shading. It showed 3 dogs, not precisely, not photographically, but truthfully. Their bodies, curled near a sleeping girl. One dog's ear twitched, another had its nose near her knee. A third seemed to rest its head on her chest, listening. Lucas blinked. The breath he'd been holding came out in a whisper. "That's you," he said gently. Still, Sienna said nothing, but her pencil stopped moving. He studied the dogs again. Something in the way she had drawn their eyes. Not fierce, not feral. Gentle. Changed. Then came the moment he hadn't expected. Not today. Maybe not ever. They're not the same dogs. Lucas turned slowly. He wasn't sure, at first, that he'd heard right. But Sienna was staring down at her drawing, her voice barely more than a ripple in a still pond. Her lips had moved. Her breath had carried the words. Her silence had broken. Lucas swallowed, unsure whether to reply or just listen, the way you'd listen to the first bird after a long, hard winter. Then she said it again, louder this time. "They're not the same dogs." A pause. "Neither am I." The words settled like ash. Soft, final, unmistakable. Taro, sensing the tremor in her voice, lifted his head and pressed his muzzle gently against her arm. She didn't pull away. Lucas could feel his throat tighten, and he didn't know whether it was gratitude or grief. Maybe both. He glanced at the drawing again. "What changed?" he asked softly. Sienna didn't answer right away. Instead, she set her pencil down beside the paper and pulled her knees in, resting her chin atop them. "I think—" Her voice wavered, but she let it come. "I think they stopped waiting for someone to fix them." Lucas blinked, his heart catching in a strange, unfamiliar way. "And you?" Sienna didn't speak for a long moment. Then, slowly, she looked up at him for the first time that morning. "I stopped thinking I was broken." The fire still wasn't lit. The room still carried the sharp edge of autumn air, but in that quiet space between their words, something warm bloomed. Outside, the dogs shifted Mira, rising, stretching, and padding closer. Naira followed, slow but steady, her posture no longer stiff. They curled beside Taro and Sienna, forming a quiet circle, as if this moment belonged to them, too. Lucas stood and stepped back. He didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. Sienna returned to her drawing, but not before looking up one more time, not at the paper, not at the dogs, but at him. "Thank you," she said. Lucas didn't answer. He only nodded, his throat too full. Then he walked to the fireplace, struck a match, and lit the flame. They gathered beneath the sky, the color of slate, not stormy, not still, just a hush before something sacred. The town came in quiet clusters, unsure why they were there, but knowing they couldn't not be. Lucas stood near the fence, Mira beside him. Sheriff Denton arrived with the council. No one spoke. Then the gate creaked open. Sienna walked into the pasture, small in stature, immense in stillness. No special clothes, just her red sweater, and the kind of calm that made the wind pause. Behind her, Naira, graceful as dusk, Taro, limping but proud, and Bristle, nervous but rooted. No leashes, no commands, just presence. When a councilman cleared his throat too loud, Bristle flinched. Taro growled but stopped when Sienna turned. Not a command, just her gaze. Mira whispered, "They're watching her." And they were not for instruction, but alignment, like shadows drawn to flame. Denton stepped forward. "We're here. Let's see it." Sienna walked the pasture, slowly. The dogs followed. She brushed grass with her hand. Naira mirrored it with her snout. Taro paused when she paused. Bristle trembled until Sienna crouched and whispered something only he heard. The crowd watched, breath held. A child whispered, "She's not scared." Lucas crossed the boundary. "They're not the same dogs," he told Denton. "They were trained to attack," Denton replied. "They've been retrained to listen. To her." The words hung in the air. Something shifted. Then Sienna turned, met Denton's eyes. No plea, just steady truth. Naira stepped forward, bowed. Not submission, recognition. Taro followed, lowering his injured paw gently. Bristle hesitated. Then Sienna raised her hand open, and he came, and bowed. The crowd held still, the silence pulsing like a heartbeat. Denton exhaled. One of the council whispered, "They weren't trained for this." No, Denton murmured. This isn't training. Mira wiped quiet tears. Lucas asked Sienna, "Do you want to come back now?" She turned to the dogs. They stood and walked with her. A voice in the crowd rose. She's not the same girl. Another. And they're not the same dogs. The silence became something new. Not fear, but reverence. The next morning they returned. Not for a vote, not for ceremony. They just came. Sienna stood in the pasture, her jacket still torn, her boots still too big, but she stood like she belonged. From the tree line, Naira appeared, walked straight to Sienna and stood beside her. Then Zol, light on his feet, tail brushing grass, he dropped at Sienna's feet, like laying down his shield. Then Taro, limping, scarred. He walked to her, rested his head on her shoulder. No commands, no tricks, just choosing. Someone whispered, "They're not trained, they're choosing." Denton stepped forward. "Are you afraid?" he asked Sienna. She turned. Not anymore. Behind her, the wind lifted her coat like a banner. Denton nodded slowly. "There's your proof. Not of obedience, of presence." No applause. But the silence shifted again into release. The mayor approached with a folded speech. He didn't open it, just looked at the girl, at the dogs. "You came expecting a vote," he said. "But I think we've all seen what we needed." He folded the speech, pocketed it. "These aren't threats. They're not what we feared. What they are is home." He looked at Denton. "No vote?" Denton's voice was quiet. "Not needed. No gavel. No raised hands. Just acceptance." That day, Lucas quietly posted a new sign at the edge of the pasture. "Spring Hollow Sanctuary, where silence becomes trust." Children approached first. A boy reached out to Sol. Sol wagged once. Irene, the hunter's widow, whispered, "We were so wrong." Sienna stood, reached for Naira. The shepherd leaned into her hand. "I thought they were broken," Sienna said, voice sure. "They weren't. They were just waiting for someone not to fear their scars." A woman stepped forward, the baker's wife. Naira approached and pressed her nose into the woman's hand. A collective breath. Not applause, but awakening. Someone clapped once, then stopped. It wasn't needed. They watched as the dogs returned to the field. And Sienna, barefoot in the dew, followed. Not behind them, beside them. The town, once torn by fear and memory, simply healed. Not by law, but by witness. It didn't begin with a proposal or a speech. It began with a drawing, a faceless child, standing between three shadows with tails low and hearts forward. Sienna, once silent, called them bridges. Not survivors, she told Lucas, just ways across fear. That whisper became something real. Mira drafted outlines. Lucas spoke to the mayor. Sienna, always quiet, spent her mornings drawing with Sol beside her, and her afternoons inviting other quiet children to draw too. The program had no banners. It simply opened with soft blankets, cedar air, and 3 dogs, Sol, Naira, and Taro. No leashes, no fanfare, just presence. The children came slowly. Raiden, who hadn't spoken since the fire, Emily, who flinched at every sound, Thomas, who described fear as gray like wet shoes, and the dogs stayed. Thomas once asked, "Why do they stay, even when we're quiet?" Sienna answered softly, "Because quiet is where they learn to stay too." Raiden drew Sol again and again, always with ears tipped forward. "He never runs from the fire in my head," he whispered one day. By the end of the month, the barn held not just children and dogs, but stories. Emily smiled for the first time when Naira rested a paw on her hand. Tomas asked to bring his grandmother, so she can see what quiet looks like when it doesn't hurt. Raiden asked if Sol could sleep near his bed, just to let the smoke know I'm not afraid. And Bridges of Trust wasn't a program anymore. It was a sanctuary built from eye contact and silence, pause and paper. Letters began arriving. Teachers, caseworkers, grandparents, all asking, could they come? Could they bring someone broken? Sol's name appeared again and again. The German shepherd once feared, now walked beside Sienna like a shadow made gentle. He moved with grace. When children hesitated, he waited. Saturday still. Sometimes he even rolled to his side scar exposed, as if to say, I've hurt too. In Redfield, a boy named Tyler, silent since the fire that took his dog curled against the wall. Saul approached without sound, lay down, then rolled gently to expose his scarred ribs. Tyler slowly slid to the floor, didn't touch, just mirrored him. Later, Tyler whispered to Mira. He knew. Saul didn't need commands. He just knew. In Hillcrest, a boy with a stutter rested his hand on Saul's head. Saul closed his eyes. In another town, a blind girl flinched from her left side, so Saul always walked with that side facing her. Sienna never told him what to do. He simply watched, felt, stayed. He's not here to protect me, Sienna once said. He's here to witness. Evenings in Spring Hollow became letter-reading rituals. Dozens arrived each week. Crayon drawings, wobbly handwriting. One said, I'm not scared anymore. Thank you. Molly, age 7. Another came from Vermont with $20 and a note. This is for the little girl I once was, and the wolves I was told to fear. Sienna kept drawing wolves with soft eyes and children who no longer curled inward. Mira taped their art across the hallway. Lucas read emails out loud. One clinic launched a project called 3 Shadows in Light, based on Sienna's first sketch. One letter came with a photo, a stuttering boy sitting under a tree with a dog and a popsicle. Another came with a carved wooden wolf. The sender wrote, I don't believe in much anymore, but this story, it's something I needed to. The town began to change. The sheriff left apples by the sanctuary gate. The bakery added empathy buns. The post office clerk wore her Sunday cardigan, just in case reporters show up. But inside the sanctuary, the rhythm remained simple. Sienna fed the dogs each morning. Saturday on the steps with Saul. Listened more than she spoke. Drew fewer wolves. Now, not because she'd stopped seeing them, but because she no longer needed to prove they existed. Lucas once said, these people aren't just thanking you. They're remembering something they didn't know they forgot. Sienna nodded. Or a voice they didn't use. One evening, a letter arrived from a nursing home in Iowa. A drawing of a hand and a paw. 5 words. I remember now. Thank you. That night, Sienna stood at the window. Outside, Saul lay curled under the moonlight. Fireflies blinked like tiny lanterns. She whispered, they were always gentle. It was the world that forgot how to see it. She wasn't trying to lead a movement. She wasn't trying to heal the world, but through charcoal lines, quiet dogs, and the soft breath of children unlearning fear she had. And Saul? He never needed to say a word. He just stayed. The cottonwood tree had stood long before any of them were born. Its roots ran deep, quiet beneath the soil, cradling the earth like a memory that refused to be forgotten. In spring, the wind caught its seeds and scattered them like whispers. In fall, its leaves turned gold, as if remembering something precious. And now, in this gentle dusk that followed months of ache and courage, it had become a place of stillness, a place of truth. Sienna sat cross-legged beneath its branches, the worn sketchbook balanced on her knees. Around her, the world exhaled. She didn't rush. She hadn't done that in a while. Saul lay just a breath away, his chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. He was older now. His muzzle grayed, but his eyes still followed her, like a compass would follow the North Star. Always toward her. Always steady. Taro curled nearby, one paw lazily covering his nose, ears twitching at the songbirds. His trust had returned slowly, like a shy visitor who only knocked when the house was quiet. And Naira, majestic, lean, alert, watched over them from a few feet away. Her coat shimmered in the last of the sun, but her gaze wasn't on the sky. It was on Sienna. It always had been. Sienna's pencil moved without hesitation now. No trembling, no pauses to fight the lump in her throat. She was drawing them, all 3. Saul with his solemn eyes and scarred shoulder. Taro with his crooked tail and sleepy grin. Naira, proud and protective, the kind of presence that made others sit up straighter. But in the center of it all, she was sketching herself. Not a smaller figure. Not off to the side. Not silent. She drew her hands open, resting on her knees, palms facing up as if to say, I'm here. I see you. I'm ready. Her hair was longer in the drawing. That had been Lucas's suggestion. Because, he'd said with a crooked smile, every good story deserves a little growth in the end. Sienna had laughed. Actually laughed. Her real hair tickled her cheek now, caught in the cottonwood's breeze. She tucked it behind her ear, then looked at her paper. She'd drawn her eyes meeting Saul's. A quiet line between them, not a leash, not a command, just presence. Recognition. It had taken her months to believe she was allowed to be seen. Now, people waved when she passed. Children, especially the quiet ones, reached for her hand, or Saul's fur, or the safety of Naira's distance. And Sienna would kneel down, matching their height, and say, "You don't have to speak. Just stay." Lucas had built the bench by the tree last week. It was simple, strong. Mira had added a carved plaque along the edge that read, "This is where the silence ended." And it had. That first day she'd said it out loud, "They're not the same dogs. Neither am I." The ground had shifted. Not in the dramatic way people write about in books, but in a small, almost invisible tilt that changed how sunlight hit her face. Since then, her voice had grown not louder, but clearer, like water finding its way through stone. She shaded the tree branches now, each stroke gentle, deliberate. The cottonwood had become a witness. It had watched her cry into Saul's fur. It had held her secrets in the folds of its bark. And now, it stood as a cathedral, a quiet sanctuary for moments like this one. "Not a girl in silence anymore," she whispered. The wind caught her words and carried them upward. She didn't notice Lucas approaching until he sat beside her, careful not to step on the sketchbook. He didn't say anything at first, just followed her gaze to the paper, then to the dogs. "That's a good likeness," he murmured. Sienna nodded. "They're more themselves here than anywhere else. And free," he smiled, rubbing the back of his neck. "And you?" She looked down at her drawing. Her heart was right there on the page, open, visible. "I think I'm catching up." They sat in the hush of evening, the kind only found in small towns and wide skies. "Do you remember," he said gently, "the first time you let Saul walk beside you without a leash?" She smiled. "I remember I was more scared than he was." Lucas chuckled. "Yeah, but he never left your side." And Sienna touched the corner of the paper where she'd shaded in Saul's paw slightly too big, a little crooked exactly as it was in real life. None of them ever did. "No," Lucas agreed. "They never will." The dogs began to shift. As the sun dropped lower, Taro yawned. Naira sat taller. Saul nuzzled against Sienna's leg. There was no cue, no command, just presence, just knowing. Sienna closed the sketchbook slowly. She didn't need to keep drawing. The scene was already carved into her. "We should head back," Lucas said softly. "In a minute," she replied. She stood, brushing off her jeans, and walked to the center of the three dogs. Then, without a word, she sat again, this time within their circle. Saul rested his chin on her knee. Taro leaned into her back. Naira stepped forward and laid down beside her, spine to spine. And Sienna whispered again, "Not a girl in silence anymore." The cottonwood leaves rustled above. A soft applause. Dusk settled over Spring Hollow like an old quilt, soft at the edges, warm in its hush. The cottonwood leaves rustled above as if remembering, as if whispering a lullaby they once sang to no one in particular. The sun, now low and quiet, brushed gold across the town's rooftops, where stories had once curdled into fear and now folded gently into healing. Sienna stood at the edge of the field, near the broken fence that had once meant keep out. Now it simply leaned weathered, almost forgotten. Behind her, the dogs moved with silent grace. Sol, a step behind like always. Taro, his tail brushing the grass in lazy arcs. And Naira, ever alert, ever loyal, walking close enough to catch Sienna's shadow. She'd grown taller. That was the first thing people said now when they saw her. Taller, and not just in inches in the way she carried her silence, in the space she no longer feared taking up. The trio halted when she did, just before the invisible line that marked the town's end and the rest of the world's beginning. That boundary had once been absolute. Cross it, and you were on your own. Step back, and you still weren't safe. Sienna remembered the cold of it, like fog in her lungs, like hands gripping her small shoulders saying, "Don't speak, don't trust." But that was then. She crouched beside Naira and let her fingers slip into the thick, wild fur behind the wolf dog's ears. Naira leaned in without a sound, Her eyes, gold-rimmed and ancient, blinked slowly as if saying, "You don't owe them fear anymore." A truck passed far off on the ridge road distant, a world away. Otherwise, all was still. Sienna turned her head slowly, gazing back at Spring Hollow. The town looked smaller from this spot, nestled under the horizon, like a child curled into sleep. She remembered every corner of it now. The library, where she first found her voice in charcoal and sketchbook. The diner where Mira had once slipped her a muffin and a wink, no questions asked. Sheriff Denton's office, where hard truths had finally cracked open like seeds. And then there were the faces, the ones who had doubted, who had whispered about the girl who didn't talk, and the animals that shouldn't be here. Some of them had changed, some hadn't, but none of it mattered anymore, because she had. Sienna let her hand rest atop Naira's head and breathed in slow earth and pine, dust and fir. Her voice came softly, not louder than the wind, not meant to be. "They weren't dangerous," she said, eyes fixed on the horizon. "They were just scared, just like I was." It wasn't a speech. It wasn't meant for anyone's ears, but the skies, too. But behind her, Lucas had come quietly with Mira. No cameras, no grand announcement. Just them, standing at a respectful distance, listening like the way people listen to a prayer they're not sure they deserve to hear. Mira's hand found Lucas's lacket. He gave the smallest nod. They both remembered not just the howling nights or the courtroom glare, but the quiet in Sienna's eyes when no one understood why she kept drawing the same three shapes over and over. A girl, a wolf dog, and a shadow with golden fur. Sienna stood, brushing her palms on her jeans. Sol nudged her leg, and she leaned down, placing a slow kiss between his ears. His eyes fluttered closed. A breeze passed then, not sharp, not cold, just enough to lift the edge of Sienna's hoodie and carry her words outward, toward the hills, toward wherever stories go when they're finally free to leave the page. From behind, a child's voice called softly, "Miss Sienna?" It was Ollie, the boy with the stutter, the one who hadn't touched a dog since the fire. He stood near the fence line, backpack askew, a drawing crumpled in one hand. Sienna turned slowly, as Naira walked ahead of her, not protectively, but as invitation. Ollie hesitated, his shoes scuffed the dirt. But then, as if pulled by something gentler than courage, he stepped forward. "Nira sat." Sienna knelt beside her again and held out her palm not to the boy, but to the silence between them. Ollie stared at it. And then 1 inch, 2, he reached out and let his fingers graze Naira's cheek. The wolf dog didn't move, didn't flinch. Her breathing remained steady. Ollie's shoulders lowered. A breath left his chest like an invisible weight. Sienna smiled. She didn't need to say anything else. That night, as the stars arrived without hurry, Sienna's words would be written in the school paper, not because she'd spoken them again, but because Ollie had. In a child's handwriting, misspelled but true, it read, "They were just scared. Like me. Like her. But now we're not." And somehow, in those few words, Spring Hollow's story turned from fear to belonging, not by vote, not by law, but by truth, softly spoken at dusk. The morning was soft as breath. Mist curled along the banks of Whispering Creek, low and hushed like a secret kept gently by the earth. The water shimmered golden beneath the dawn light, not loud or grand, just enough to catch the warmth, enough to remind you that something sacred had passed through here. On the ridge above the water, Sienna sat cross-legged in the grass, her sketchpad resting in her lap but forgotten. The pages fluttered quietly in the breeze, like wings not yet sure of flight. Beside her, Sol lay stretched on his side, chest rising slow and steady. Naira perched a little further down, her gaze following the movement of the creek, ears flicking at the sounds of robins waking. And Terrasweet, heavy-hearted Terror, rested his head in Sienna's lap, not asleep, just home. No words passed between them. None were needed. This place, this quiet, this breath of stillness had become something more than land and trees and water. It had become theirs, not by claim or by fence, but by being brave enough to remain, to exist, to forgive. She looked toward the bend in the path, where the forest gave way to what once had been fear. The place where, not long ago, People had gathered with raised voices and furrowed brows, where the word dangerous had been said with more fear than understanding. But now there were no barriers, no red tape, no watchful eyes counting hours. They had stayed. The vote had come and gone, but even before then, something in Spring Hollow had shifted. It was in the way children started leaving apples on the fence posts, in the way elders walked slower, watching the dogs from afar, then closer, then finally close enough to offer a hand. It was in the silence of former critics, whose fears now stood quietly beside their new understanding. The sanctuary was no longer just a promise on paper. It was breath. It was pause in the grass. It was the weight of a dog's head in a child's arms. A breeze stirred, lifting strands of Sienna's hair across her face. She closed her eyes and listened not just to the wind, but to the rhythm of life here. Birds sang, not loudly, but like they'd always been part of the story. The water murmured like lullabies passed between generations. And somewhere deeper beneath bark and stone, there was something that felt like a heartbeat. Soul rose first. No sound, just a stretch, a soft grunt, and then motion. He trotted forward with the ease of someone who no longer had to scan for exits. Naira followed, her stride elegant and proud, the way only a creature once hunted could move when finally safe. Taro paused, his gaze searching Sienna's face, as if asking, "Are we still welcome?" She smiled and scratched behind his ears. "You're not going anywhere, big guy." Then, without command, the three began to run out away, not toward, but with the land, with the day, with one another. Their forms cut through the sunlight in long arcs of joy, tails high, mouths parted in silent laughter. They bounded through the brush, over the shallow creek, and into the tall grass where the breeze danced with them. Sienna stood and watched, arms crossed gently over her chest, her fingers curled lightly over her sleeves, not out of cold, but out of reverence. There was a kind of peace that didn't ask for applause. This was that. She thought of the first day she met the mud-covered, trembling, wild-eyed ghosts clinging to survival by instinct alone. She remembered the cuts, the shivering, the emptiness in their gaze, and how, even then, something unspoken had passed between them, a fracture in each of them that, somehow, recognized the other. And now they ran tongues lolling, paws pounding like drums in celebration not of freedom from, but freedom with the right to stay, with the right to be seen, with the right to be known not for what they had endured, but for who they had become. The golden breeze picked up again, and with it, something shifted in the light. Sienna could almost hear voices on that wind. Not loud, not literal, just echoes, of the girl who once didn't speak, of the dogs once too afraid to trust, of the people who once didn't believe. They were all still here, just gentler now, less sharp at the edges, like wounds scarred over not to hide, but to remember. In the field, Saul stopped. He turned toward her, eyes dark and deep. There was no bark, no whimper, just gaze. And in that look was something wordless, but understood, a promise kept, a thank you not needing to be said. Sienna raised her hand, fingers slightly open. Trust, that's what remained. Not as some grand declaration or award-worthy headline, but in the small, everyday moments, in the way Sol would press his weight against her side when a stranger approached, in the way Taro nuzzled the pockets of children who still bore night terrors, in the way Naira stood sentry by the back door of the community hall not guarding, just being. They had stayed, not because someone allowed them to, but because finally they were allowed to choose. The sanctuary was no longer a place they fled to. It was home. Not perfect, not without ghosts, but honest. And when people came from towns over from cities burdened with suspicion and stories of bite marks, they didn't come to challenge anymore. They came to learn, to listen, to kneel slowly in the grass and hold out trembling hands toward creatures once feared and whisper, "May I?" Sienna turned her eyes back to the tree line. The dogs were there now, rolling in a pile of fur and limbs and laughter. Sunlight struck the grass in streaks of amber. The creek whispered its lullabies again. And somewhere in that wind, where the old pain used to live, there was only one thing left behind. Trust. Sometimes, what stays with us isn't the noise of the world, but the quiet loyalty of a dog who waits at our side no matter how long it takes. This story, like so many before it, reminds us of the fierce, unwavering love animals offer us. German Shepherds in particular carry that kind of love with pride, not loud, but deep. Not flashy, but enduring. If you've ever looked into your dog's eyes and felt like they understood something unspoken, you're not alone. That connection is real and rare. If you'd like to deepen that bond, there's a gentle, thoughtful resource I came across recently. It's not a product, just a place that honors the relationship between humans and their dogs. Something to explore, maybe, if you're feeling ready. I'll leave it here if you're curious. And if this story touched something quiet in you, maybe give your dog an extra long ear rub tonight. They'll know why. Take care, and thank you for loving the way you do.